on home-to-school transport. I'm Sam Corcoran, Labour leader of Cheshire East Council and the CCN spokesperson on climate change. I'm pleased that we're starting today's proceedings with In Pursuit of Climate Change. Yesterday, I launched the session at 8 a.m. It's nice to have a lie-in and see you all at 9 a.m. today, and good to see you here. The session yesterday was about how to deliver tackling climate change on a low budget. Today's session covers more how do you change behaviour? Well, I like to make things fun. I cycle to most council meetings and it takes me no time at all. The reason for that is the health benefits of cycling are such that for every minute you spend cycling, your lifespan is extended by 1 minute. So looked at over the course of my lifetime, cycling to work takes me no time at all. I am delighted this morning that we are joined by two speakers who are here to talk about some of the best practice that councils can draw on. Ed Wincup is here from the Behavioural Insights team, who were previously known as the Nudge Unit, and who work to apply behavioural science to drive positive behaviour change. Ed works with government departments, private sector, and third sector organisations across a range of pro-environmental policy areas, including water and energy, transport, diets, and green finance. But first, we are going to hear from Anne Pickering from Climate Emergency, who some of you may have heard from recently in conjunction with their Council Climate Plan Scorecards project, which aims to promote progress that councils are making. Annie previously worked at People and Planet on their University League. So please welcome Annie Pickering.
Thanks for having me, and I hope you've been enjoying the conference. As they said, I'm one of the co-directors of Climate Emergency UK. Yes, I know how this works. Great. So just for a brief summary of who we are, in case you don't already know, Climate Emergency UK was founded back in 2019, and originally we measured and assessed all written climate action plans of councils, which was published in January 2022. But hopefully you know us more from the work we did last month, where we published the Council Climate Action Scorecards, where we assessed all UK councils on their climate action. And that's a flavour of some of the media hits that we've had since launching on the 18th of October, both nationally and in local government chronicle. I also had a story in the MJ last week. And it's not just about trying to get media hits, it's also about engaging with councils. And it's been really good to see that we've had over 20, and it is more and counting, councils publishing their own press releases to let us know what they thought of the scores and how they're going to work to improve on it. And I'm not going to repeat, too much of the obvious. Most councils have already declared a climate emergency. Most have a climate action plan. And we all know that up to 30% of emissions are within the scope and influence of local authorities. So we know that residents and many councils do really care and want to make a difference. So that's why we're focusing on councils and how we can support them. So before I go into the results of the action scorecards, which you may already have seen, I just want to briefly cover how we create the scorecards. So it's a pretty big process. And the methodology was created last year in consultation with over 90 different organisations, and that included councillors and council staff, plus people from across the sector. We then had an advisory group that kind of provided a little bit more in-depth advice as we create the scorecards, which again had councillors and council staff represented. So the marking process is 3 stages, which you can see on that slide. The first stage is we have a beautiful team of trained volunteers that mark councils based on publicly available information, and we also analyse the responses we get from the Freedom of Information requests from councils. The second stage is when each council gets their first mark and they're able to review and comment on that. And this year we had 74% of all UK councils responding to our right of reply. So thank you so much for the time you spent to respond to that. The final stage is where we collaborate both the first mark and the right of reply and give the kind of audit and give the final score, as well as integrating some national data within that. So yeah, it's a pretty big process, which is why we are going to do another scorecards, but not straight away. There's a lot of information in our scorecards, and I can't go through everything today, but just to give you an idea, there are 7 sections, and there's about 10 questions per section, but that does vary on topic, and it also does vary on council type. So for example, in the planning section, I think there's only 2 questions for county councils, because what we look at in that section is councils' local plans, and we know that county councils aren't those lead councils when writing those local plans. So hopefully you've already seen the results, but in case you haven't, I do want to kind of run over the numbers to get an idea of what the picture is looking like. So this shows the average scores of each council types. So we present all of our data in 5 lists to recognise the different powers that each of those council types have. And the box at the bottom shows the range, and I think that's really important to look at because there is such a range and variety of action and kind of commitment and action from councils. You see with county councils, it ranges from 12 to 53%, so it is quite a big difference. Just doing a little shout out to Oxfordshire here, because they are the county council that scored one of those. I could see one of the councillors there. They scored 53%, which is the highest scoring county council in the scorecards. But I'm not being too favouritist, because I want to give you a bit of a kind of overall picture as well. There were only 41 councils, including Oxfordshire, that scored over 50% in the action scorecards that we published last week. And then from that, there were about 30 to 40 councils that scored over 80% in some sections. And I think it's really important to notice that, because it just shows that one council might be doing particularly well in one section and really, making a lot of progress, but maybe not so well in others, and there is a lot of variety within that. And here are the county councils, or at least the councils that I think are part of the county council network, that scored over 80% in a particular section. So hopefully it's big enough, but I will read it out. So you've got Essex, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, and Devon that all scored over 80% on the buildings and heating section. And then you've got Durham and Cornwall, which scored over 80% on the collaboration and engagement section, which I think is definitely something to be proud of. You can see there's also work to be done with some of their other scores elsewhere. So I've shown you some numbers, but I know that doesn't really show everything, because next, I'm going to dive into kind of how councils got these scores and what it actually means. But before I do that, I just want to briefly discuss kind of why we think the national picture is the way it is. And given that so many councils have declared climate emergencies and have climate action plans, we know there is some interest to take action here. But for us, the low scores across the board really represent that there are national barriers that are limiting the extent to which most councils can take faster and further climate action. I'm sure you already know what some of those barriers are, but for us, a key one is the lack of funding and the government policy U-turns, which make it, harder for councils to plan. It provides inconsistency with projects that they're able to deliver. We know that Rishi Sunak's proposed policy rollbacks last month, on diesel cars and boilers do create further policy uncertainty for councils. And I think it's really important to recognise that there is stuff that can be done at a local level, but there is this national picture, and we hope that our scorecards can be used at a national level as well in order to try and improve the ability and the powers and the resources available to councils to take that climate action that we know so many of you want to. But enough about the national actors. You guys are all with county councils or other councils, and I want to give you briefly some of the stories behind these numbers and what it is that these councils have done to be kind of on track or making good progress towards net zero, and share some of those best practices. So Cambridgeshire County Council scored one of the highest scorers in the buildings and heating section. So this is kind of what we found as independent people when looking at what the council had done on climate action. So Cambridgeshire County Council scored marks for every question, and in some of the questions, there was 2 or 3 marks available, and they only got 1, but they did pretty well. And the reason they did so well is kind of a summary of those things there. So they provide both funding and support to private homeowners to retrofit their own homes, which is through Action on Energy across Cambridgeshire, and I know other councils have similar programmes. They have supported a Solar Together programme, which is where they encourage residents to come together to collectively buy solar panels at a cheaper price. They've supported the creation of community renewable energy, which is Swarthmore Prior's heat network. They've also got that funding for decarbonisation of homes, and they also have a staff member that works on retrofit 3 or more days a week. So as you can see, this isn't about complete retrofit now, because we know that is a huge cost, but it's about the enabling actions that councils can take towards decarbonising buildings and heating. The next one I wanted to show you is Cornwall County Council. I don't expect you to read all of that because there's a lot of data there. But the reason I wanted to show you this is to give you an idea of the wealth of the data and knowledge that is there in our action scorecards. So this is the list in the planning section of what the Cornwall Council's local plan has done. And for us, there is a lot of things that are included in Cornwall's local plan that are positive actions working towards net zero. So some of those include making sure the area-wide net zero target is a strategic objective of the local plan, a commitment to not building on floodplains, and providing a minimum energy requirement for new builds during their planning policies. And also on this far right side for you, you can see the number of other councils that also scored marks on that question, which I think is really helpful to see in order to understand which other councils have similar policies in their local plans and where you might be able to learn from. But there are a few councils that have done quite so many climate positive things within their local plan as Cornwall. Now I just want to talk a little bit about kind of specific questions rather than always looking at kind of overall councils and kind of complete actions, because there are a lot of kind of, steps that councils can be taking. So I know we've got more conversations on transport later, and you may have already had some as well. But some things that we think are really key in order to work towards net zero in transport is ensuring, we'll start from the top, 20-mile-an-hour zones in all residential areas. And we know it takes a while to implement, so in our scorecards, if it was a draft policy that was in the process of being implemented, such as I think for Oxfordshire County Council, the mark was awarded. We also think it's important to have controlled parking zones across residential areas, such as what Dorset has done, in order to discourage car use for short journeys. And then finally, school streets. In our scorecards, only 17 councils have 30 or more school streets in their areas. And we know that school streets don't need to only happen in huge cities. Somerset Council has been doing some in Frome, and it could definitely be replicated elsewhere. And just looking at a different section now, best practice in our scorecards isn't just about the councils doing great stuff. It's also about how councils are working with other actors in their local area, because we know that councils have that really important role locally to work with others, but also what can they do to advocate for those further funding and powers that would support councils to take that climate action. So in the collaboration engagement section, there are marks awarded where councils are membership of particular organisations, and I've listed them there, but also if they're taking part in case studies and doing that kind of sharing of best practice, which I'm sure is happening a lot at this conference. We also look at this in this section about whether a council has lobbied the national government for further powers or funding or kind of further action on climate. And we do that through an FOI request that we sent to councils. And we also look at whether councils are working in partnership with other people locally, whether that be health services, local schools, local businesses, and cultural institutions, because we know decarbonisation needs to happen everywhere. So, we assessed all 388 councils in the UK, which is a lot. And so what I've shown you today is really just a drop in the ocean of some of the information that is available. And we know that councils are under-resourced and councillor time and staff time is precious. So that's one of the reasons we created this scorecards, to provide this wealth of knowledge and information that you can use to easily understand what other councils are doing and where you might want to learn from. So I'm just going to cover briefly how you might want to use our scorecards. Firstly, read the methodology in full. We provide details on exactly the criteria that we're scoring councils against, so do have a look at that online. I can hear some people talking about this comparison tool over here. So you can compare up to 5 councils and see exactly what they scored, and also against each question. I chose 4 county councils that are kind of vaguely in the south to see how they vary score-wise, but you could use any councils, whether they're your neighbours or kind of similar in other ways. We've also produced a document of 15 actions councils can take for climate action, which are relatively low capacity or low cost. And I would definitely have a look at that on the how to use the scorecards section of our website. But don't just believe us. We don't think that the scorecards will be useful for you. Luke from Surrey County Council, I don't know if they're here, they're a staff member, used our plan scorecards last year to try and understand what other councils were doing in relation to green skills, and used that in order to then go and talk to those relevant councils to understand what they were doing and how they could work together. You can also download the raw data, which is the same data that's on the website, but in a spreadsheet format if you really want to dive into it in detail. So get in contact if you're interested in that. And we are looking for other ways to be supporting councils to use the scorecards and work towards net zero together. We've just finished the local climate academy, which is our first kind of training program for councillors and council staff. But we're looking at doing more. So do, talk to me afterwards if you've got ideas of what you might be interested in. So that brings me to the end, and I hope this has been a good brief summary of what the scorecards are, what some councils are already doing on the road to net zero, and how you can use these scorecards to kind of learn from each other and take that action that we know so many of you are doing and trying to implement in other ways. I'm also going to be around for the rest of the day, so I'm always happy to talk to you afterwards, or we'll take some questions after we've heard both of us speak. So thank you for listening.
Right. Thank you, Annie, and if I can now introduce Ed Wincup.
Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone, and firstly, just want to say pleasure to actually be here and speak to you. So my name is Ed Wincup. I work as a senior advisor in the energy and sustainability practice at the Behavioural Insights team. And my chat today is going to be about the application of behavioural insights to drive sustainability across councils, across district authorities and unitary authorities as well. It's going to be quite a brief talk, so my aim really is to hopefully trigger some ideas, some thoughts on some of the applications and sort of spark some interest in the area. But of course, appreciate that some of you might have some pre-existing knowledge of behavioural science as well, but in that case, hopefully some of the examples I talk through today are still going to be quite interesting and novel to you. So without further ado, the way I've structured this talk is sort of in 2 key sections, the first of which is to give you a bit of an introduction about the organisation I work for, the Behavioural Insights team. So as Sam mentioned in the introduction, we started life inside government. We were then known as the Nudge Unit. This was in 2010. And gradually over time, we became our own separate organisation. In 2014, we became known as the Behavioural Insights team, operating slightly outside of the Cabinet Office where we started life. And in 2019, more recently, we were acquired by the research and innovation charity Nesta. But over the course of that sort of time frame, our remit has always been the same, and that has been to apply behavioural science theory to try tackle real-world policy challenges. And as you can see here as well, our practice has expanded over the course of that time as well. So we now have offices across the globe. Our focus is no longer just UK policy, but we work across many different countries, many different continents as well. Of course, it's quite hard to define the Behavioural Insights team without also defining behavioural insights and what we mean by that. We see it as having 3 key components, the first of which is taking evidence about human behaviour. So this is forming a holistic understanding of how people behave in a real-world setting, and our team's quite multidisciplinary. We have people who have backgrounds in psychology, economics, anthropology, sociology, and we take all of this evidence to form this comprehensive understanding that I've just mentioned. And a second component is all about application. So how do we apply that understanding of how humans behave in the real world to tackle these policy challenges that we are presented with? The third key aspect of behavioral insights is this point around rigorous evaluation. And at BIT, we really pride ourselves on testing empirically the effect of all our behavior change interventions. This is important not only to see if we're achieving the desired outcomes of our interventions, but also to see, importantly, whether our interventions are resulting in any potential backfire effects, for instance. Because one thing I should say about behavior change and the way people behave is it's not always entirely predictable, so equally very important to test and evaluate for that reason. So that's a quick introduction of BIT, but how does this fit into the topic of sustainability? How does it fit into decarbonisation? Well, one of the key things that we do know is that net zero is going to, well, our goals of achieving net zero, I should say, by 2050 is going to be very largely dependent on widespread behaviour change. And the example that we often point to is this example here on screen. This is work done by the Climate Changes Committee, their balanced pathway to net zero specifically. And based on their estimates, they highlight that in order for the UK to achieve net zero by 2050, around 53% of emissions are going to stem directly from the adoption of low carbon technology. So that sort of comprises new and emerging technologies such as the adoption of heat pumps, the installation of home energy efficiency improvements, the adoption of EVs, solar panel installation, etc. A further 9% is going to come from curtailment behaviors, so that's reducing current behaviors. So when I mention that, I'm referring to things such as reducing beef consumption, reducing energy use in the home, reducing how much we drive our cars, etc. And then you'll see as well, there's another 38% termed as supply-side changes. And what is meant by supply-side changes are infrastructural changes, so broader changes to do with the energy grid, where we source our energy, so the transition to renewables. And while on surface value that is potentially slightly less relevant to behavior change, there is an underlying element, of course, here of social buy-in, social acceptance, which of course has behavioral elements to it. And behavioral insights and behavioral science can also lend itself in terms of understanding, for instance, people's attitudes, people's beliefs, and how we can potentially shift those in our favor ultimately. So crucially speaking, behavior change is really, really important for our transition. And at BIT, in my team, we work across a number of different policy areas. It's not just all about decarbonisation, but that is one of the key focuses, of course. Don't have time to go through all of these different examples today, but this is just to give you a flavour of the sort of multidisciplinary work we actually do. So a whole range of different policy areas. So that was a very quick introduction of BIT and the team. For the next sort of section of the talk, I really want to just provide you some applied examples of behaviour change interventions in the field. I'm going to do that by structuring it around BIT's EAST framework. So we love our frameworks at BIT. We've got one for every sort of challenge that we actually encounter. This is probably my favourite one and the most applicable. So this framework we designed to essentially help practitioners design behaviourally informed interventions and fundamentally effective behaviour change interventions. And it's called the EAST principle. The EAST principle is broken down into 4 key principles you can see on the screen here. So these are easy, attractive, social, timely. The idea is that if you follow these principles, you're going to design effective interventions. When I say easy, what I'm referring to is creating interventions that make the desired behavior change or drive a behavior change outcome that is actually easy to enact. And I'm not just talking about making it physically easy to enact a behavior, but crucially also cognitively, mentally making it easier for people to make certain decisions. The second principle is the attractive principle. This is all about not just attracting attention to a particular behavior, but making it attractive in terms of the appeal, making it salient to individuals. Then we have the social principle. The social principle is all about the recognition that we are fundamentally very social beings. Our behavior is very much informed by the behavior of others, and we really need to recognize that when designing interventions. And the fourth principle is a timely principle, which really fundamentally is about recognizing that we are far more receptive to particular interventions or far more receptive to enacting behavior change at specific moments in our life or during certain events. And I'm going to speak through each of these principles with an applied example, the first of which is the easy principle. So as I mentioned, all about making things not easy just in the sense of physically easy to enact behavior, but also cognitively. And the key sort of phenomenon I wanted to talk to you about here is this principle of defaulting. Now, when I talk about defaulting, what I'm really talking about here is the tendency for people, I should say the overwhelming tendency for people to go with a pre-selected choice within a given choice set. Now, there's two key reasons why we're so predisposed to go with default choices. The first of which is we aren't very good decision makers. We're overwhelmed with stimulus in our day-to-day lives. We try to take shortcuts, in essence. And going with a default often presents what we see as the easier choice. It doesn't require us to take any sort of mental effort. And it's particularly important when we're talking about decisions that we don't particularly classify as being immediate or particularly important. The second reason defaulting is quite effective is because default choices are often perceived as being an implicit recommendation, so something that is seen as perhaps more of the optimal choice. So to illustrate the power of defaulting, and I should say it's one of the most researched effects in the behavioral science literature, I wanted to sort of show you this study that was conducted in Germany where the authors used defaulting to nudge people into using renewable energy tariffs. So this was noted quite a few years ago now, but I think it's really, really effective in highlighting sort of the effect size you can get from this defaulting effect. So in this particular study, what they had were two groups. In one group, there was an opt-in group where the consumers were opted into a regular energy tariff, non-renewable energy, and they were instead given the opportunity to opt into a renewable energy tariff. And then in a second group, people were instead opted into a renewable energy tariff by default. And instead, they were given the choice to, instead of actually opting out of that tariff if they wanted to. And you can see that the difference here in default led to this this tenfold increase in customers actually sticking with the renewable energy tariff. So quite a huge effect size there. And I should say the context of the study was carried out in Germany. The price of renewables at the time compared to sort of a standard tariff was equitable. It wasn't too dissimilar. So it just really illustrates sort of the power of this particular intervention in terms of reinforcing this fact of making choices as easy as possible for people to enact. And a more relevant example, I suppose, of this carried out in the UK policy context is pension auto-enrollment, for instance, where similar defaulting approach was taken to get people to contribute more readily to their pension pots, and has been a huge success in terms of the amount saved across the UK's workforce. That's the easy principle and a quick example. The second principle is the attractive principle. As I said, it's all about making things attractive, drawing attention, making things salient. And the example that I wanted to run through again, in this case, is an applied example. It's the plastic bag levy, applied in 2015 in the UK, 5p charges for plastic bags. This was up to 10p after a period of time. And the reason I bring this up is when we discuss the attractive principle, often people's minds go straight to the financial incentive. How do we financially incentivize or disincentivize behavior change? But the key thing to consider is it's not always just about the monetary reward or the monetary penalty. And I think this example really illustrates that point, because an evaluation was conducted last year looking at the effects of this levy. What was found was that plastic bag use has dropped considerably, both overall and on a per capita basis. And it sort of begs the question as, what actually is going on here? Because 5-10p on surface value, yes, it's an amount of money. It can be a significant amount of money to some, but in the greater scheme of things, it's not something that you'd expect to reap these massive sort of changes in behavior. And so I find that behavioral science here has a number of key explanations that really illustrate why it's important to consider behavioral science in terms of incentive design. It's one of the key things we do at BIT. So for instance, one of the things that this plastic bag levy illustrates is, again, it's sort of the power of defaults, because once upon a time, before the levy was introduced, we'd go into a shop and almost expect people to ask us if we wanted a bag. It was sort of a given. Nowadays, you go into a shop and you get asked, or you have to go out your way to actually ask for a bag. So that constitutes a slight change in the choice set. We're no longer defaulted into assuming that we're going to receive a bag. The second key component to this levy is sort of a social aspect that it introduces. We've now slapped this charge onto plastic bag use. We've acknowledged that it's harmful for the environment for that reason, and what that introduces is a sort of social dimension, where actually buying plastic bags is associated with sort of a negative behavior, and it's constituted a slight shift in the norm, where we are slightly sort of avoidant of plastic bags because of that sense of guilt that might sort of affect our behavioral response. And there's also a third mechanism in that obviously plastic bags used to be free. We hate to pay for things that we used to receive for free. And so even though it's just a 5p, 10p charge, this is something that makes the behavior all that more salient when we're planning. And so it sort of brings to mind and enables us to plan, I should bring my reusable bag in this case to sort of avoid this charge that hurts us so much when we come to the decision of getting a plastic bag. So a number of different explanations as to why this levy might be effective, but I think it's really important to consider all of these different behavioral dimensions and mechanisms that underpin these types of incentives when it comes to sort of designing these types of incentives and funding to encourage certain types of behavior. So quite a nice example at sort of illustrating that effect. We've now got the social principle. The social principle, as I said, is all based on the fact that we are highly social beings. We're very much influenced by the behavior of those around us. The classic study here, which is a really sort of seminal study in the field of behavioral science, is around social comparisons used in energy bills. So you may be familiar with this, you might not, but in essence, this particular study involved the redesign of an energy bill that was sent to customers. In the energy bill, what they did was they added information on how their energy consumption stacked up compared to their neighbors, and provided some feedback on how they were tracking in terms of their performance. And this very simple intervention included in these bills resulted in sustained sort of energy savings, both in long term, but also during peak times of energy consumption. And I mean, the first thought you might have is that the effect sizes here are very small, which of course they are. But it's important to think here about the complexity and the relative cost of this type of intervention, because when applied at scale, it becomes relatively cheap compared to sort of these changes in energy consumption that result, essentially. And I suppose the underlying mechanism behind this type of intervention is that, as I say, we are very much influenced by the behavior of others. What we're doing here is providing people with a point of reference by which they can then shape and inform their own behavior. So this raises that salience of their consumption, and they can think about exactly how they can adjust their behavior accordingly. And we see similar effects with the smart meter rollout, specifically with in-home displays, for instance. That provision of feedback allows us to take that into account, take it on board, and then change our behaviors accordingly. Though, of course, we don't have the social element there, but that's a similar sort of mechanism. And I should say that this is quite a prevalent sort of type of intervention in the field. It's been replicated across a heap of different policy areas. Just this year, we ran a trial ourselves with Affinity water provider in the Southwest, and it involved a very similar intervention where we provided this comparison in terms of people's water consumption, and it led to similar effect changes in terms of people's water savings. So the second example I wanted to illustrate here, really quickly, I'm conscious of time, is household solar contagion. It sort of illustrates, again, this social principle. In essence, we're all just a bunch of copycats. There's this observation and phenomenon whereby solar panel installation tends to be sort of concentrated and tends to be found in high densities in certain neighborhoods and urban areas. And researchers wanted to investigate, what was going on? What is it that's driving this sort of high density of solar panel installation? One of the key hypotheses was the fact that it's all about visibility. People see solar paneling installed on neighbors' properties, and they say, that might look good on my house, I'm going to do the same, install it on my property as well. And recent research conducted has sort of tested this hypothesis, and it's interestingly found that the visibility of solar paneling actually does impact the rate of installation in these areas, and specifically solar paneling that's installed in visible areas on sides of buildings tends to reap sort of more accelerated adoption rates compared to solar paneling which is not possibly as visible. So again, really interesting finding, something that illustrates sort of this copycat phenomenon and how our behavior is very much shaped by others. The fourth principle and the final principle is this timely principle. As I mentioned, this is all about acknowledging the fact that we are more likely to change our behavior when interventions are delivered at timely moments. And I think a really effective study in illustrating this point is work that we did with Portland City Council in the US. In this particular study, they had just launched a new bike sharing scheme. And we worked with them on a very simple basic intervention. It was just a leaflet drop around neighborhoods, which included a promotional code to encourage people to sign up to this new bike sharing scheme. And what we found in our analysis was really interesting, because what we discovered was that people who had just moved home into these areas with bike sharing schemes nearby were up to 4 times more likely to take up the scheme. Now, again, the effect sizes here are incredibly small, and I think that reflects the type of intervention, really. It's a leaflet drop that typically people just disregard. But what's crucial here is the effect size difference between individuals who simply had a new station installed within their area versus those who had just moved home. And I guess the crucial mechanism here, and reason we see this sort of difference, is that when people move home, it's this sort of process where habits are completely disrupted. We're prompted to pause our existing habits, in this context, transport habits, and it prompts rational consideration of different choices, different alternatives. And that was one of the hypotheses that we used to explain these findings, and I should say that we're doing some work now with DFT, exploring this principle. It's still quite nascent in terms of its level of exploration and research, but it's something that we're looking into quite closely in terms of transport change. But you can see how this same principle could be applied across other policy areas, for instance, energy consumption, water consumption, home energy efficiency improvements as well. I am conscious of time, so I just wanted to impart some final comments in terms of where I believe sort of councils can play the biggest role in terms of applying behavioral insights principles, but I would, of course, be very willing to hear your thoughts on this as well. Just a couple of thoughts here. So I think one of the key advantages that councils have is access, direct access to consumers, direct access to businesses. Often in our work, we work with central government, and while they have a benefit of funding, what usually is the blocker is direct access. We struggle for access points. So I think this is a really, really big advantage that councils do have, particularly when it comes to leveraging timely moments, as I just mentioned. You could consider targeting new movers, for instance, with some particular behavioral intervention to drive a sustainable behavioral outcome. There's other areas that I wanted to very quickly highlight. Apologies, I am conscious of time. And those are, firstly, leveraging the easy principle. So really, it's all about simplifying processes as much as possible, reducing friction, crucially. So this includes things like planning permission, applying for funding, connecting people to trained installers, obviously relevant to heat pump installation, home energy efficiency improvements as well, one-stop shop services as well. Because these are all known barriers to a series of different tech adoption behaviors that are outlined in the sub-bullet there. There's other benefits and other things that councils can also ponder, and that's sort of showing people local show homes, for instance, to illustrate what home energy efficiency improvements look like, what heat pumps look like, what EVs look like, build up the familiarity as a first step in encouraging certain behaviors. We've mentioned, it's been mentioned, sort of collective purchase agreements. I think, again, not only in terms of easing financial burden on consumers, but also in terms of easing processes, sort of the procurement process of certain technologies. And then lastly, it also comes down to the sort of right financial incentives and designing of funding schemes as well. But they're just some very quick thoughts I wanted to impart with you. And yeah, just wanted to now open up to the QA, and thank you for your attention. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. We do have 5 minutes for questions, and if I could encourage those at the back, do come and take a seat. But does anybody have any questions? We do have some roving mics, so if I can go to Richard. We've got 2 questions over there.
Thank you. Richard Clure, leader of Wiltshire Council. I'm also co-president of UK 100 and chair their Countryside Climate Network. I was really quite excited when the climate scorecards came out. I love metrics, I love data, and I started reading them, and some were good, and the more I read, the more concerned and then angry I got. The climate scorecards conflate not using pesticide as having the same impact as a 2% reduction in emissions in a county area. And food waste. Food waste actually will increase carbon emissions if I were to collect it across Wiltshire because of the diesel required to do it. My question here is, I'm really concerned that you've done more harm than good in this by adopting what is essentially a metropolitan, ideologically driven set of criteria and not an empirically measured set of criteria based on the reduction in carbon emissions, which is what is critical. How are you going to get this, perhaps learn from the behavioral scientists next to you about how we're going to turn this into a method that encourages councils and actually rewards the behavior that will reduce carbon emissions, rather than something that feels, when you read it, far more ideological and honestly a little bit trite, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Can I take another question as well, and then I'll go to the panel?
West London Furnace Council. Two fascinating presentations there. Ed, I think you've redesigned our car parking machines. Got some really good ideas there. But Annie, I wanted to just ask, we're a brand new council from April, and we're not on the scorecards. When are you going to repeat the scoring, and will we be on next time?
Okay, Annie, do you want to take those two questions then?
Yeah, so we do want to do the scorecards again, and currently our plan is to publish in 2025. So yeah, Westmoreland and Furness and other councils will be included if they're new councils as of yet. In relation to the methodology, it is hard. Like, there is currently no UK-wide metric on what net zero should look like for local councils. The way we've done the questions is there is weighting of individual questions, low, medium and high, but also the sections. So if a council is doing well in buildings and heatings, that is a more heavily weighted section, because we recognise that in the UK, most of our emissions come from buildings and heatings and transport, but less come from areas such as waste reduction and food. It's really complex, and we've done, we think, along with consultation with others, the best that we can do to try and understand what the journey to net zero could look like for local councils. This is the first time we've done it, and we recognise we have learnings to take from it. So we are going to be conducting a review process in the new year, and would really welcome yourselves or anyone else you know that it might be worth connecting us with to try and understand how we can look at the metrics in a way that might work better. But I guess the final thing to say is climate change is happening, and we know globally that we are not doing enough, and we don't want to be creating metrics that look favourable for the sake of looking favourable. We know councils really struggle, and we know you're doing, in some places the best that can be done, but there is a lot more that needs to be done, and I think it needs to be a fair assessment, an independent assessment, to understand where those barriers are, where the successes and where those challenges are.
Thank you. Any other questions? Take one at the front. Any others? While the mic's coming, I'll just comment on the scorecards. I mean, clearly the methodology is wrong, because Cheshire East came out as slightly worse than Cheshire West Council. But that did prompt me to go and look into the detail of it. And as Annie has said, that prompted me, when I saw some of the methodologies, there were things there that I thought, okay, I should be doing more on that. So it has prompted me to look back at Cheshire East to see how we could do more. Thank you. If I can take the question from the front then.
Yeah, hello, it's John Holland from Warwickshire. I absolutely support solar panels on roofs, and I think the building regs should be changed so that all new houses are just built with the whole roof as solar panels, and that's it. However, the installations that are going in at the moment rely on being controlled by a mobile phone app written in China with a connection to China. And I'm just wondering, if we got into a political dispute with China, can the People's Republic of China switch off all of the existing solar panel installations? Now, I have asked this of our supplier, and the only answer I can come up with is yes, they could.
Now, Ed, I'm not sure whether nudge theory can extend to nudging governments or even the Chinese government, but do you want to comment on that?
I think what your point raises, so I can't answer in terms of China's control of the solar paneling system, but what I can say is your question does surface a wider question around these new and emerging technologies and their impact on the environment, because I know the creation process that underlies solar PV is emitting in and of itself. So it does raise considerations around, similarly to EVs, for instance, all this creation of battery lithium materials coming in and being used. So there's a question around broader sustainability of emerging technologies at the moment, which is an interesting consideration. There's also consideration there around the reliance on external parties to drive our transition to renewables, which is a tricky one to square. I can't really say much about that reliance because I think there is some regulatory and policy moves that need to be made in terms of making the UK a bit more self-reliant in that sense. Yes, I can't really comment too much on China's role in terms of solar PV.
So can I just ask people to thank Annie and Ed, and we'll move on to the next session. Thank you.
Right, good. Hang on. Good morning, everyone. Right, welcome to this next session. I'm Roger Goff. I am the leader of Kent County Council and CCN spokesperson on Children's Services. And welcome to the launch of a report which has already generated a lot of attention and interest, I think rightly so, on making home-to-school transport sustainable. This is an issue that we've already highlighted in a number of areas. So if you look at the budget survey that CCN published at the start of the month, that showed that the home-to-school transport, and particularly within that SEND transport, is one of the key pressures that faces all our member authorities. And it's a pressure which has only tended to grow over time. And particularly, I think we've seen further substantial increases in the last year. So this is extremely timely in terms of the pressures that we all face. So with the intention of supporting councils in addressing this and to ensure we can properly highlight those costs to government, and I think, again, the report's already had its effect in terms of being able to do that, CCN commissioned ISOS to carry out this major piece of work. And as I've mentioned it, we are officially launching it today, although, as I say, it had quite a lot of coverage already. So to talk us through the research, we're joined by Natalie Parish from ISOS, who led it. Natalie has a background in children's services, having begun her career in the Department for Education, where she worked on policy on school improvement. She's also worked as an assistant director for strategy and performance in children's services in Tower Hamlets. Since then, she's led a number of high-profile research projects on education and children's services. With my own work in the LGA, I've seen quite a bit of that, and it really is outstanding work. And she's currently working with both CCN and the LGA in projects on special educational needs due out next year. So Natalie's going to set out the key findings and recommendations from the report. Also delighted we're joined by Joanna Killian, the current chair of ACCI, the Association of County Chief Executives, and Chief Executive of Surrey County Council, where my notes tell me she works closely with a particular leader. She's also served since June 2021 as Local Government Improvement Commissioner at Liverpool City Council, appointed by the Secretary of State. Joanna has over 30 years' experience working in the public sector, which my notes tell me includes time at Essex County Council. Some of us might have our suspicions of what that means, but Joanna will respond to the report's findings and recommendations based on her experience in addressing those issues, both at Surrey and at ACCI. So we'll try and stick as tight to time as we can, given that it's coffee break after this. But I think, as I say, this is something which has already generated a lot of interest, and it's really good to actually now be officially launching this report. So, Natalie, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today and for giving us the opportunity to work on this fascinating research project. We really enjoyed it, and we couldn't have done it without the support of all the county councils who both responded to our survey, who made time for the fieldwork, who contributed to webinars and other engagements. So very grateful to all of you. Here we go. So you'll probably be, many of you, aware of the task that we were given at the start of this research, but basically it was to understand the current demands for home-to-school transport and what that meant for expenditure in county council network member authorities, and then to project forward what we thought the likely demand and expenditure might be in the future if the underlying policy and the conditions around home-to-school transport didn't change. We wanted to explore the views of member councils in terms of what you are doing to deliver the home-to-school transport duties, what the best practice looks like, and what your ideas for the future are, and think about how existing legislation might change to make these duties more sustainable. The way we carried out the research was that we did some analysis of all the published sources of data. As mentioned, we did a survey and fieldwork, and then used that data to then create some forecasting models for demand and expenditure going forward. You can see on the right there, I should have said, that that's a map of the fieldwork councils that we work with. So we special thanks to Devon, to Oxfordshire, to Shropshire, Nottinghamshire, and Cheshire East. So this chart is the sort of the big chart in terms of numbers. This is the 10-year financial view. It's made up from, for the numbers between 2018-19 and 21-22, that's the published Section 251 data that many of you will be familiar with. Then for 2022-23, we used the survey data that you all provided and scaled that up to be representative of all councils in the county council network. And then from 23-24 onwards, this is our forecasting data, which is based on the presumption that underlying policy doesn't change. What you can see is that this year, 2023-24, we project that county council network members are going to spend over £1 billion on home-to-school transport. What you can also see from this chart is the biggest sort of driver of growth is that sort of dark grey band in the middle, which is your pre-16 SEND transport costs, where we're projecting that that's likely to grow over the decade from 338 million to over 980 million, just for the pre-16 SEND transport costs. If there's no significant change in policy, and obviously this is a big if, we think that by 2027-28, CCM member authorities may be spending over 1.4 billion on home-to-school transport. If you then scale that up to the whole country, that would be expenditure of around 2.6 billion. Now, of course, forecasts are only as good as the inputs that you put in, and there may be change along the way, but that's what we're projecting at present. As you all know, home-to-school transport is one of those areas that the financial burden disproportionately falls on CCN member authorities compared with other authorities. So the sort of very broad rule of thumb is historically you've accounted for about 57% of expenditure, but you have about 42% of the relevant population size. And you can see that if you look at the per capita spend, it's £239 per head in CCM member authorities, £126 per head in other authorities. The two charts are interesting because it shows that this difference is particularly marked for mainstream home-to-school transport. That's the chart at the bottom where you can see CCN much, much higher per capita spend. The difference isn't quite as marked in the send home-to-school transport, but that is accelerating more quickly in CCM member authorities. So you can see that gap is actually getting bigger. It's interesting that when we tried to model both mainstream and send home-to-school transport, you can account for almost 90% of the variance in mainstream home-to-school transport with sort of factors that are easy to model, like the size of the local authority, the relative rural or urban nature of it, how dispersed populations are, the number of children. When you try and model send home-to-school transport expenditure, you can only model about 30% based on factors like the number of children with EHCPs and how many children in special schools, which suggests that a lot of that variability is also dependent on more local factors that you can't model. For example, how far away are your special schools from your main population centres? What are your policies around send home-to-school transport? But I thought that was quite an interesting difference. Obviously, one of the sort of reasons why expenditure is going up is because demand is also going up. So these projections are based on survey data. There's no published data on the number of children receiving home-to-school transport, but it shows that between 2018-19 and 2022-23, which are the years covered by our survey, we think numbers have gone up by around about 20,000. If current trends continue, this might look like transporting around 400,000 children in CCM member authorities by 27-28. The factors that are driving that rapid growth in demand are going to be familiar to all of you. Certainly the very rapidly rising number of children and young people with EHCPs, and you could write a whole other research report about why that's happening, and indeed we are in the process of doing a piece of research on exactly that with LGA and the CCN. The extension of SEND provision up to 25, which of course just means that there are more young people over the age of 19 who might be eligible for transport, more children and young people in special schools, and then two which were perhaps a little bit new in this piece of research, we hadn't heard so much before, but certainly more young people requiring alternative provision and education other than at school. Now, these might not be young people with special educational needs. These might fall into the sort of the mainstream home-to-school transport group, but because of the distance from home of these different alternative provisions and the complexity of transport arrangements, they are creating, I think, a new financial burden. And then asylum-seeking children and young people were a big issue in a number of the authorities that we connected with. Of course, the mathematically minded of you will have noticed that the demand chart that I showed here hasn't gone up as quickly as the expenditure chart. And that's because when we talk about home-to-school transport, there's a sort of relatively simple equation we can think about. On the left-hand side here, you've got your demand. That's the number of children and young people you're transporting, which is going up. But on the right-hand side, you've got your unit cost, the cost of transporting each of those young people, and that's going up even more quickly. And in fact, what local authorities described to us was it was a perfect storm of funding pressures. So I'm going to talk briefly about that right-hand side of the equation there, the different factors that are contributing to rising unit costs. So first of all, you've got the sort of underlying market and inflation factors. You can see in the chart here that you can look at how the unit costs, so this is costs per pupil transported, have increased in both cash terms and real terms, so stripping out the impact of inflation. What's interesting here is that the send transport costs have increased very dramatically, both in cash terms and real terms. When you look at the mainstream costs, when you factor in inflation, they have increased, but when you take out inflation, you actually see the unit costs have decreased, and we think this is because of some of the work that local areas have been doing around recommissioning, and also some of the changes to eligibility criteria for mainstream. But overall, the factors that are contributing to that inflationary environment, if you like, are certainly the fragility of the provider market. A lot of colleagues spoke to us about the difficulties they'd had, for example, with large coach companies going bust, and the impact that that's had on the bottom line for recommissioning those services. A lot of colleagues also spoke to us about this being the first moment for recommissioning a lot of these contracts post-COVID, and seeing that sort of post-COVID bump in costs suddenly coming into the bottom line at this point in time. Driver recruitment and retention is having an issue. That's, people talk to us about an ageing workforce and an increasingly unpopular job, which means that it is becoming harder and harder to recruit drivers, both for coaches and for taxis. And some of the vehicle licensing requirements also adding to the underlying costs over and above the impact of inflation. So you've got your sort of basic unit cost increasing. What we also know that particularly for children and young people with special educational needs, the length of the journeys are increasing. So we know that as the number of children with EHCPs has increased, so has the number of children and young people in special schools. And we can see in the survey data that around 50,000 children and young people in CCN member authorities are now being transported to special schools, far and away the most common destination for those receiving home to school transport for SEND. We also know from the fieldwork conversations that we had that special schools are largely full. So what happens is when a child or young person is presented to the local authority and needs a new special school place, they're typically not placed in the special school that is closest to them. They'll be placed in the special school that happens to have a place at the time at which they need it. So we heard in a lot of areas about this sort of complex and somewhat illogical pattern of transport, where you might have children from the west of the county being taken to the east of the county, and children from the east of the county making the similar journey in reverse, because that was the place that was available at the time that the child needed it. And of course, when a place later becomes available, there's a great deal of reluctance, understandably, from parents to change the school place, because that creates a lot of disturbance. So you see that sort of illogical pattern. You also see a lot more use being made of independent and non-maintained special schools. That's both a parental choice thing and an issue about maintained special schools being full. It's interesting in terms of our transport numbers that almost as many children with SEND are being transported to independent and non-maintained special schools as are being taken to mainstream schools, which I think says something interesting. Obviously, the longer the distance travelled, then the bigger the cost. And some of these distances are really very large indeed. So we heard of one young person making a 104-mile trip every day. And I don't think that is a sort of a complete outlier. I think many authorities could point to similar distances being travelled. The other thing that's driving up the cost of transport is the transport type. So what we can see is increasing children and young people being, particularly with those with SEND, being transported in taxis and in individual taxis. We see that the numbers being transported in cars for the last 2 years have been on a par with the number transported in minibuses. Previously, minibuses tended to transport more children and young people with SEND. There are quite a lot of different factors contributing to the increased use of taxis. There is a point about the complexity of children's needs, and we heard about children with very complex medical needs and also children with very complex behavioural needs needing individual taxis for their own safety or for the safety of others. I spoke about that increasingly complicated patterns of journeys, which means that children are not travelling on the same routes as other children, and therefore there aren't the opportunities to bundle them up. And we did also hear a lot about parental expectations and needing to work in a really early and constructive way with parents in order to dispel the idea that every child with SEND ought to be getting transport in an individual taxi. So those are all the things that are contributing to greater costs. We also heard about the things that local authorities are doing to try and address those spiralling costs. Certainly, so the tranche of things at the top of this slide are mainly things that people are doing, I think, to address the core costs. And the tranche of things at the bottom of the slide are things that people are doing to try and address the issues of demand from children and young people with SEND. So along that top line, you've got an awful lot of authorities are now getting to the point where they've reduced the eligibility to statutory minimums or very close to statutory minimums. An awful lot of work going on around different methods for commissioning to try and get the best possible contract values. Some experimentation with where it might be more economically advantageous to use fleet vehicles rather than to commission external providers. And if you're interested, I can talk afterwards about some of the examples we saw of that. And a number of areas also thinking quite creatively about how they might invest in and maximise the public transport network to take some of the pressure off home-to-school transport. Then on the bottom tier, absolutely critically is this point about communication between SEND teams and home-to-school transport teams. So the earlier that conversation happens and the more creative and engaging that conversation is in terms of how you work with parents, the more likely it is that you will come up with a whole package solution, both in terms of placement and transport, that can meet needs but is also economically sustainable. A lot of work going on to think about how to support inclusion in mainstream schools better and how to reshape special school provision and specialist resource provision to make it easier to access from all different parts of the community. A lot of creative thinking going on now around using personal transport budgets in different ways, and certainly many local authorities moving away from the idea that you would just pay the standard 40 pence per mile and thinking, well, what would it mean to a parent if we were to say, well, we'll pay you half the cost of what it would cost us to transport the child, and what might that do to freeing up the system? And then, of course, independent travel training. Everybody knows this is brilliant for the young people concerned in terms of giving them the life skills that they need in the wider world. Although a note of caution that unless you have the public transport network to fall back on, and indeed unless you can do that confidence-building work with parents, sometimes this can be a drop in the ocean compared with the rising tide of costs elsewhere. And I think that was the sort of overarching message that we got, that everybody is doing some really creative, innovative things to try and bring down costs, but it is not sufficient to counteract the other forces which are leading to this surge in demand and surge in expenditure. So what we have set out in the report is both the idea that there might be a short-term injection of funding and a longer-term reshaping of the system. And we tried to set out what might be some of the principles on which the system could be reshaped, and we've set out 5 here. These are not set in stone, these are up for debate. They're a starter for 10, really. But that every child should be entitled to an education, and children shouldn't be prevented from accessing that education because they can't get to school. That it's the responsibility of the parent or carer to ensure that the child attends school, and that means making arrangements to get their child to school. That local government has a role in supporting parents to fulfil their duty, but maybe not taking over that duty. And crucially, that they might focus public resources on the families who have the least capacity and resources to arrange or provide transport themselves. And I'm not convinced that the current legislation allows local government to do that. Recognising that local government, and following on from the topic that you were talking about earlier, has a role in delivering action to fight climate change, and that therefore the default expectation should be that wherever possible, home-to-school transport should be based around public transport networks or active travel options, and to phase out, wherever possible, the use of individual transport. And that finally, and this I think is the clinch, that as a nation we have a responsibility to create a truly inclusive education system so that all children are able to be educated as close to their home as possible. And that does speak to those bigger changes around the SEND system that will be part of the research that we will be publishing in the spring. Very quickly then, because I'm conscious of the time, some of the there are more recommendations for national change in the report. They're put there as prompts for thinking and discussion rather than the last word in this matter, but I've picked out some of these for this presentation. There is a bigger SEND system question here, and we've captured this in the first recommendation about developing and applying the optimum combination of curriculum, training, funding, inspection and accountability levers that might incentivise and support mainstream schools to be as inclusive and effective as possible as working with children with SEND. There's a lot packed into that statement, and I recognise that. But I don't think we can afford to say, well, the SEND system's got multiple challenges and therefore we can't do anything on home-to-school transport until we sort that out. I think we also need to think about the home-to-school transport legislation in parallel. So one of the ideas that came up, and this was by no means universally liked, but it was talked about by enough people, I think we should be having a debate about it, is whether there should be a national means testing policy so that families above a specified income threshold, and that's something that would need to be set delicately and sensitively, might be required to make a financial contribution to homeschool transport if they use it. I think there also needs to be a debate about the statutory walking limit eligibility criteria. It was conceived in 1944, I think, at which point something like 17% of households had cars. Now 78%, and by the way, probably every village had a primary school. Now 78% of households have cars, and children tend to live further from school. So actually we need to think differently about that. You might think, and we could think about, well, what would it mean if we said, if we factored in public transport in the equation? What would it mean if we factored in other modes of transport, cycling? I think there just needs to be a debate about how we determine eligibility, full stop. Then I think there's something about public transport, and I think there is something about targeting bus improvement schemes at areas which have little existing public transport, and the evidence shows that that hasn't been the case historically. And really, public funding for home-to-school transport ought to be taken into account when thinking about what could be the financial benefits of investing in a public transport scheme nationally. I think local government or local SEND partnerships, if that's the place for it, need to have additional powers and additional capital funding to be able to create new specialist resource provision or indeed special schools where there's undersupply. At the moment, if you want to create a special school, as many of you will know, you have to apply for a free school. It might be 8 or 9 years before you actually see the places, by which time that cohort of children will all have moved on. They'll be adults. I think there is an issue with the tribunal. I think there is, so the recommendation here is a sort of an either-or one, that maybe rulings on placements can't be made without full consideration of the relative transport costs. What we hear from fieldwork authorities is those transport costs are often put aside in the tribunal decisions. Or that a placement decision made in tribunal doesn't supersede the local decision on the nearest suitable school for the purposes of transport. So you could think about it either way. I think greater consideration needs to be given to the idea of pick-up or drop-off points in order to fulfil the home-to-school transport duty, getting away from the idea that for everybody it's a door-to-door service. And statutory guidance could make it clearer that local government should only be offering, and therefore parents should only be expecting, individual taxi transport as an option of last resort. and that the expectation is that transport arrangements should be reviewed annually with a presumption towards encouraging greater independence over time wherever possible, because this would be very much in the interest of the children and young people as well. As adults, they will need to be able to negotiate the world as best they can, and we don't necessarily do them any favours by not enabling them to create that greater independence in relation to transport. So I'm going to pause there. I would be very keen, I know that my colleagues are going to come in with some reflections, and then there'll be some time for conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. That was terrific. I'm going to hand straight over to Joanna for a number of reflections in response to that, and then we'll have time for some Q&A.
So just to say, I think we all welcome the report. I think it is incredibly familiar reading to us, and absolutely welcome the sort of the proposals about how we could move the system forward. In Surrey, we have about 10,000 children or pupils who currently use transport, and that's gone up by 1,000 over the last 3 years. Back in the heady days of 1920, we were spending £43 million on transport, and that felt like a huge amount of money. This year, we think we'll spend about 59 million, and that includes an overspend of about 4.7 million, despite incredible, diligent work to control our costs. And we're assuming that for next year we will have to plan to spend £63 million. And for many of us, it seems like an extraordinary use of money to transport children around our county. So our response is, how can we tackle some of the high cost pressure points that are driving these costs, but what is the strategic response that we need as a local authority to make sure that more of our children can learn in great environments much closer to home? So, just like the report, 85% of our students that we are transporting around have SEND. And again, the average cost of transporting children with SEND issues has risen by 14%, despite all the policy interventions we had put in place to peg those costs. The acuity of need is significant, so absolutely the report resonates very strongly with us. Like many of you, we've had numerous routes handed back to us over the last few months, and when we've gone out to re-procure, on average, costs are between 30 and 40% higher. The increase in cost for solo taxi journeys up 87% in our place. So it's an unaffordable model, which we think money would be better spent on improving outcomes in a completely different way. So we've made loads of the policy interventions that this report proposes. So moving to personal budgets. With our tin hats on, we have moved to absolutely minimise the use of solo taxis. We've instituted a system of collection points, double tin hat requirement for that, and absolutely sort of put in place the importance of using public transport. So as part of a wider strategic response, investing more in our buses, thinking about how we can use dreaded active travel systems to encourage use of public transport, but also walking. But it has been a really difficult journey to get those policy changes in place. Some very difficult conversations with our parents and schools, as you can imagine. On top of that, we have sort of bolted down our operational practices, improved our contract management, rethought how we commission, we've improved our customer service offer, and we're planning earlier, we're thinking about our fleet, but still it isn't enough to stem this huge sort of pressure coming through. So better process has been important doing it earlier. But at the end of the day, I think our view is it's about how do we generate the school places, special school places, nearer in our communities to discourage the need to keep travelling. So, like many of you, very significant high needs block pressure. We're in a safety valve arrangement that was, I think, complements some of the strategic plans we had anyway. We are making significant investment into additional places, new special needs school, because I think we think that is the way to keep very vulnerable children in their communities in a more inclusive environment rather than sticking them on buses and having them sort of travel miles and miles across the county. But it is still very fraught territory for us. And the safety valve is an important mechanism, but some of the inflation pressures that are working their way through the contracts we have for construction, for delivery of places, is a challenge for us now. So I think we absolutely recognise the features of the reports. We have put in place lots of the policy interventions. We need absolutely now reform in legislation to address some of the issues that Natalie has raised. But we also, I think, need to be sort of bold about how we can invest, stop the needs for movement and travel. Difficult, given Paul Johnson's statement yesterday, but it for me just seems an extraordinary waste of money when I would prefer, I'm sure Tim, Leader of the Year, would prefer investment into improved outcomes, particularly for the most vulnerable people that we've got. So.
Joanna, thank you. That's great. Now, we've got, according to the clock, just a little bit over 11 minutes left. I'm going to try and shave a few minutes off, given that we started late. Can I just see who would like to raise some questions? I'll just get a sense of form on this. Okay, at the moment I'll take these one by one. Let me see. I saw there's a lady there. I'll come to each of you.
Thank you. Ruth George from Derbyshire County Council. We've got many of the same issues as I've raised there, huge amount of demand. Derbyshire have always had a model of enhanced resource centres in mainstream schools, which are incredibly effective. But unfortunately, with Ofsted ramping up demands on schools, then they don't seem to take adequate account of the amount of inclusivity that schools have. So I'd really like to see on your national wish list Ofsted including special needs provision and inclusivity in their criteria to encourage schools to become enhanced resource schools. And we've also seen an increase in problems in school transport since schools don't have to publish and update their travel plans anymore. And that's an incredibly important part of enabling all children to travel to school safely, and having those travel plans imposed again will, I think, will help all school transport.
Thank you. Two very important points there. So starting with Ofsted and then also on to travel plans. Natalie first, do you want to pick up on that?
Thank you. So the Ofsted point, I think, is really well made. And as I mentioned, we're doing a piece of research for the CCN and LGA at the moment, which is looking at the broader SEND system. And I was actually talking to a head teacher only yesterday who was, well, actually it was a CEO of a trust who had special resource provision in each of their trust schools, and we're making exactly that point, that it's not taken into account by Ofsted, which does make it a disincentive. And of course it also means that those schools are extremely popular with parents of children with SEND, and become the sort of the magnet school in the area, which, you know, in a way she's delighted because it's a testament to how well they're doing, but in another way it puts tremendous burden on the finances of those schools. So I think there is a deeper point there that's really worth exploring around enhanced resource provision. And thank you for raising the school travel plans. That wasn't something that had come up in the field work, but I'll look into that further because I think that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And Joanna, anything to add on that?
I think there's an issue for us as we invest in additional SCND school places in our mainstream environments, even when we're building centres of excellence, it is still trying to manage parental expectation that instead of going to this local fantastic place, there is an ambition to go further and further because that's where their community networks, their advocacy groups recommend. So it's just the levers, particularly as we go through tribunal processes, to be able to say, actually, this is absolutely right for your child. So there's often a mismatch, isn't there, between parental expectation, and we do everything we could for our own kids, and what is actually right for them and what is available locally. And it's tricky to get that working in sync sometimes, isn't it?
Thank you. But certainly on the Ofsted point, I remember some years ago a number of us making the case to Amanda Spielman when she was, I think, new in post about the importance of this. I think there was a little bit of progress on that, but nowhere near enough. And I think both points actually very well made. Now, I've seen Paul, I've seen there's someone, why don't I take these two together? Paul and then the lady in the corner there.
Okay, thank you. Paul Marshall, West Sussex. Thank you for a very articulate sort of presentation on what is collective challenges. My fear, because we require policy changes, and in order to do that, we need our MPs to support us. And I don't think we're going to be able to rely on their support because we're coming up to a general election, and this is going to impact constituency areas for them. We're already seeing they're writing to us about the timing of EHCP assessments. Regardless of the fact we communicate with them in our monthly meetings, these challenges, and we tell them 96% of tribunals go in favour of parents. The system's broken. That's the evidence, never mind all the others. So that's my worry, is we need policy changes. You're right, it is about quality outcomes, and home to school transport is not about quality outcomes, and it's distracting us from really focusing on that. So that's the pressure point, really. Thank you.
Thank you. And if we could take the question, Deb, yes.
Thank you.
Oh, Lucy.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, Natalie, as always. My question is about the rising numbers of children ending up in the SEND system, and how much of that is due to changes in the mainstream school system rather than actually changes in families or children themselves, and whether by focusing so much on trying to control the budget on home to school transport, we're kind of dealing with the people a long time later than we should be, when actually what we need is policy changes in the education system more generally to make sure that schools are actually fulfilling their duties to keep as many children in mainstream education as is possible, because actually that's nearly always better for the children's outcomes. So I just wondered whether you had any comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So questions of what support we might get, and is it sort of symptoms rather than cause, I think. So Natalie, you first.
Thank you. So on the question of, I couldn't comment on the support from MPs because that's not really my my area of expertise. I guess one of the reasons why the CCN was keen to commission this now was recognising that we don't know when, but we are in the run-up to a general election. Obviously, we don't know what the outcome of that election will be, but there will be a government with a new mandate. And that might be the opportunity, if there ever were a time, to do things which, let's face it, are necessary but politically unpopular. I think, I think that's what this whole area falls into, that might be the moment. So thinking about what can be done short term to alleviate the pressure, and then what might be done more boldly by an incoming government post-general election, I think could be an interesting thing. And then I absolutely agree with you. This is the symptom of a SEND system that is frankly, experiencing very multiple challenges. Let me put it that way. I've written, a lot of research over the years, and we're engaged in some more now, about the various different factors which are all leading to more children in the SEND system. I think we do hear about some increasing complexity of underlying need, but I think overlaid against that, you have a whole host of different things. So you have, curriculum and accountability and inspection that doesn't necessarily incentivize inclusion in the mainstream. You have mainstream school budgets which are under pressure, which then incentivizes schools to seek EHCPs. You have system incentives, which mean that parents, as in Ofsted's words, see EHCPs as the golden ticket, because once you have an EHCP, then you have significant choice over placement and over school. So that incentivizes more parents to look for opportunities to get EHCPs. You have a tribunal system, which, as we all know, invariably finds in favour of the parent. So you have a whole lot of structural levers which are contributing to this rise in EHCPs. And I think systematically, we as a nation, we need to think about what are each of all those levers doing, and how might we redress some of those, so that we are, fundamentally everybody is interested in meeting the needs of children, young people with SEND as well as possible. And that does involve making really good local provision available, in Joanna's words, so that these children are supported within their communities and not outside their communities. So, spoiler alert, but that will be part of what we'll be looking at as part of our spring research.
Thank you. And Joanna?
I think Gillian Keegan recently said, the system, in her words, is bust. So I think there's recognition that needs to be fundamental reform, and I think this report and the one that will follow will help give evidence and weight to that. For me, it isn't just a discussion about how the education system is working. We do know that there are more children with more acute needs arriving into school unprepared. And that is a reflection for me also on how partners in health are working with us. And I think many of us that are have recently undergone area inspections of SEND. It is important there is a partnership response, and we do sort of think differently about how we can best support children and families in their lives without being in this incredibly adversarial SEND system that sort of sets up very poor relationships, and children are often stuck in the middle of all of that. So this has to be evidence for reform, and there's many of us that want to see reform because it's the right thing.
Thank you. Now, we're going to have to draw stumps at this point. Can I just thank both of you for your contributions this morning? I think that this is a terrific report that is actually helping make the weather on this issue, and watch this space for more work in this area. So, Natalie, thank you very much indeed for that. I think hugely appreciated by all of us at CCN. And Joanna, thank you for a series of really important reflections from experience on how we're all trying to grapple with this issue. So thank you, and I think we now have a break for coffee. I believe 11 o'clock we're supposed to be back in here, though we have run a little bit late. Thank you. Bye.
Right, good morning. Still morning? Yes, good morning, everyone. Well done for making it this far. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Richard Cleur. I'm leader of Wiltshire Council. I'm also CCN spokesperson now for housing. For those of you who have heard me talk about housing on CCN leaders' calls, you will be delighted to know I'm not going to talk, and that instead we're going to hear from an expert. But I'm supposed to set the scene. I won't use the notes. Housing, it's really good that housing has now come up the political agenda. For those of us who are unitaries or those who've ever served on a district, housing can be really important and really challenging. And for far too long, it's not had prominence on the national political scene. It's been a sort of poor relation. And I think as we come into the next general election, housing is going to be a much more significant factor, much more important factor for all the parties, because we know we need housing. All the data tells us we need housing. But as all of you who are politicians will know, and all of you who are officers will, when politicians talk about it, will stare with bemusement and say, why is this so important to them? Housing can be incredibly contentious. We all need housing, just not here. Or not this type, or not built by this company. So a really difficult landscape for us, and one that has a huge impact on us whether we are a planning authority as a unitary or whether we are not, because we still end up living with the issues that come from planning that doesn't deliver good housing, that delivers the cookie-cutter blobs on the edges of our villages or our towns. And so I'm delighted to introduce Nicholas Boyce-Smith, who is, I don't know if you ever have a chance to talk to him, to have a look at some of his ideas about what creates a place that is worth living in. It's really worth doing. I will get the terms wrong, so I will look it up. So Nicholas has... I can
just stand up and talk.
You can, no. The building... I'll let Nicholas run through it. I will hand over to Nicholas who's going to talk to us about how we can build better.
Marvellous, thank you.
But not build back better.
No, don't want to. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for coming. And thank you for staying up and making it through to the last morning. Can you all hear me okay? Fine, brilliant. I'm told that you want me to speak for 5 hours. Is that right, Richard? Brilliant, fine, 5 hours. So I have two hats, as the French say. I set up 10 years ago. I went mad, basically, and gave up quite a well-paid career as a banker to set up a social enterprise in my dining room called Create Streets, which does research into the relationship between place and outcome, where people want to be, where they like being, where they know their neighbours more, where they breathe healthier, cleaner air, where they're more healthy, where they walk more, and what they'll support in development. So I run a social enterprise that does that, and almost by mistake have turned into a sort of specialist design and development consultancy working with neighboured groups, landowners and developers and councils up and down the country. I was then a few years ago asked to, a couple of years ago, to chair the process, and I now chair a new arm's length public body, the Office for Place, about which more in a moment. So if that sounds like something you don't want to hear about, I guess the doors are over there, but I'll look at you and make you embarrassed if you leave. So I was asked to talk to you about two things, which were this one, and that one. Why do people oppose development, and how do you win support for more homes and creating better places? And I'm going to just sort of slip in these two subtly without you noticing. I'm going to just make the point that good design is not subjective. We can predict with high levels of confidence and growing confidence, I've got my little thing falling off here, hopefully it won't keep falling off, where people want to be and why and how. And I'll tell you a little bit about the new Office for Place, which hopefully will be of some use and interest to some of you or to your colleagues. So about 5 years ago, I actually wrote a book called From NIMBY to YIMBY, How to Win Votes by Building More Homes. And that actually did quite a lot of research into something I know you will all know a lot about, but why do people oppose homes? It was based on polling, surveying, sampling, our own work on the ground as well. I'll just summarise the theme. I've got a few slides on it. Well, first of all, people, bluntly, have fallen out of love with the future and with the system. So for reasons that are probably beyond this conversation, they don't trust the system to make new places better. There was a YouGov poll on this a couple of years ago, actually subsequent to our research. 2% trust developers to make existing places better. And when I give this talk or version of it to planning professionals, they all look very pleased about that. Thank God for planning. And of course, as you've already read, 7%, I'm afraid, trust councils or planners. It's not much better, I'm afraid, for the public sector. So we've got a big challenge. We don't trust the man, it historically was the man, in Whitehall or County Hall to know best. People want to be, they don't want to be done at or done to. People increasingly really do mean it when they say they want green development, both in terms of sustainability and, as you'll all know, in county councils, protecting greenery. Most people, and Richard put his finger on this perfectly, most people are intellectually persuaded of the need for new homes, and slightly depending on which economist you talk to and how you run your housing demand modelling, we're somewhere between 1 and 4 million short. It doesn't really matter almost where you are on that spectrum, it's a big number. But they're not persuaded that it should be done here in this way by them now. And that obviously is the key challenge. And many people, most people, want to be proud of their neighbourhoods and their places, but that pride is, particularly in left behind and less prosperous places, is deeply frustrated. So those, if you like, are some of the emotions that underpin this. Staggering statistics. In a poll done a few years ago, 2/3 of people, I don't actually quite believe this, but 2/3 of people said they'd never consider buying a newly built house, which when you think about it is a staggering statistic. Other than the antiques market, that's not true of any other bit of the market economy. I think it's got a little bit better than them, and more than twice as many people say they prefer to buy an old home versus a new home. And when you think of the greater energy efficiency and effectiveness of new homes, that is, is deeply perverse. Sorry, the numbers have disappeared off that. So that should say 56 and 53. I don't know why those have turned into dots. In some research done by what was DCLG a few years ago, most people said they'd be most persuaded to support more homes as opposed to their status quo if there was more money for services and structure and they could have more influence on the design and layout. Direct financial payment was, I think it was 10%. It was nowhere close. Now, I don't quite buy that. I think actually more people would be persuaded by money, but people do care about what the consequences of new development will be and whether they can influence it. This was a sample we did of academic literature across the world. These are the ones that came out most strongly. Disliking the quality of new homes, perceived unfair process, and lack of infrastructure. Greenery essentially sort of got put into that in the way it was sampled. Most people don't believe they can influence what's actually going to happen on planning. I mean, it's the worst of all possible worlds because actually in many ways they can. So we're trapped in this system where people don't think they're influencing, but they certainly can slow the process and get to a bit of a mess. So we're not in a good place on this, I think we can fairly say. So that's sort of to set the seed. It will get a little bit more hopeful, I hope, the talk in the next 4 hours and 45 minutes. Yeah, they think I'm joking, but I'm not joking. Quick point, and I won't have time to run through all the literature properly, but if you're piqued by what I say in a moment, on our website and elsewhere, I can easily send you, if you like, to the footnotes of the things I'm going to rattle through over the next few minutes. But don't believe the lie, ladies and gentlemen, that good design is purely subjective. It's pretty objective, and what you like and I like is completely different and is not predictable. Give me one person and I can't tell you what they'll like and where they want to be and how they'll respond to places. But give me 100 people and I can predict how roughly between 70 and 90 of them will respond. So, there are extremes. We're not automatons. We're not controlled by our environment. Ultimately who we are, our own genetics, our own background, our own character flaws and strengths is the most important consequence on our life. But where we live is a very, very important secondary or tertiary influence, slightly depending on, again, on how you run the data. And the data on this, I should say, has transformed over the last 20 or 30 years, in large and increasing part, my phone's over there, but essentially thanks to mobile phone technologies. We can now map responses, heart rates, levels of stress, spatially, in a way we just couldn't even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Here's a quick theme. So if you don't want to pay attention to the next few minutes, gentle density is your friend, halfway between the extremes of tower blocks and drive-through cul-de-sacs. Greenery little and often. I mean, that's not to say parks are a bad thing, but if you can run greenery into quotidian existence, you have the most impact on personal well-being. I'll jump over that one. Beauty really matters. I'll come back to that. What places look like, this is again where the architects go completely wrong, really, really matters to our response. We take about 90% of our information in visually. Most of us are not intellectual beings, actually, even those of us who pretend to be. And what places look like really, really matters to our response to them. Mix of uses has major effects on how much we walk versus jump in the car, and also to how prosperous places are. The edges of squares and streets are incredibly important, and the ratio of the edge to the width. Human scale enclosure and walkability works. That's not to say we must all walk all the time, but if we can create an environment in which that becomes one of the natural things to do, we're provably healthier and speak to more of our neighbours. These, I think, are not, I would hope, not controversial points. So sometimes they become controversial in what they mean. If you're sitting there thinking, what's the guy on about? I'll run through some of the data. We can see this in pricing. So this was a study we did of every single property transaction in London over a year. It was slightly stronger, but replicated findings in other cities. Areas with an above average number of pre-1900 properties, proximity to a listed building, high intersection density, which is a measure of traditional street pattern, were worth between 6 and 7 times more than new build versus old builds. This is complicated hedonic modelling, and it really pisses off estate agents, because what it basically says is place trumps new buildings, which they don't like because they're trying to sell new buildings. We got a similar relationship the other way with index of multiple deprivation. I mean, I don't quite say it like this if I'm speaking always, but bluntly, post-war housing estates are incredibly strongly correlated now still, despite 40 years of right to buy, with high index of multiple deprivation. The one exception being, or 2 exceptions being right in the centre of London. We can also see this in pricing. This is a brilliant Dutch study looking at morphologically similar but visually different buildings, where the more traditionally higher visual complexity, greater sense of place, were selling at a 15% premium to the pure, if you like, an architect would say modernist, I would just say less decorated. So this stuff matters, and you can see it in the pricing, and you can see it in the polling. We Create Streets, not the office place, do loads of visual preference surveys, and we can basically predict what the majority of people will like, I think almost without exception, certainly if we've got a strong visual contrast. They always prefer places with more texture, with more coherence in their complexity, and with greater pattern. A little bit more complex, but a complexity that resolves itself as you step away from it. Right. Garden suburbs are consistently popular. They're the stated preference, and there are lots of good things about living in a detached house with a big garden. You can control your own environment. It's a very consistent elasticity in the pricing data. However, it does come with, that's for good reasons of wanting to control your own environment, as George Orwell so often put his finger on it 70 years ago. However, it does come with very major consequences for the amount of land we need to take up, both for the houses themselves, but also for the surrounding infrastructure. This is a slightly unfair comparison because it's not British, but this is Siena and a highway interchange in Houston, Texas, to exactly the same scale. That's a little bit unfair, but the point gets made. And very low density suburbs, and this is pre-COVID stats, and I think it's not perhaps so strong now, but if they're associated with lots of commuting every day, particularly in the car, are associated actually, even when you adjust for socioeconomic status, with less community involvement, more accidents, and actually with higher blood pressure and with knowing your children and some of your family less well. In some German studies, with higher levels of divorce. So that's not to say low-density suburbs are a bad thing, but there are consequences, not just in terms of land use, but also in terms of personal health. So we Create Streets, although it says office place, I probably shouldn't have said that. We therefore make the case, which we think is robust, for what we call gentle density, which is now in the English planning system, by which we mean, if it's like, the midpoint between the extremes of tower blocks and drive-to cul-de-sacs, where you're getting most, if not in some cases all, of the advantages of a private house, but on a lower footprint and with the advantages of proximity and lower land take. Clear block patterns like that, with clear backs and fronts, are associated with lower crime and with cars driving more slowly. More moderately trafficked streets. This is a famous study from America that was replicated in Bristol a few years ago. These are similar streets with differing levels of traffic. You can read that. The lines map friendship patterns. And knowing our neighbours is good for us as long as we're not forced to talk to them when we don't wish to. This is the heavily trafficked. That's the lightly trafficked, and you can see what's going on there very clearly. There's a slight niggle in the data, which is that people tended to stay living in the lightly trafficked street for longer than they did in the heavily trafficked street, but I would argue that is an obvious secondary effect. Modest front gardens like this is from a project we're doing in Grimsby, are in a series of studies in Denmark, Australia, and also actually in Holland, associated with knowing more of your neighbours. Again, a good thing. Too big a front garden, and you're hiding behind the bush polishing your car. No front garden at all, and there's nowhere to cut the roses as your neighbours go past. So these types of things, again, that's not to say you're controlled by having a small front garden, you're not. But it does have an impact on your daily existence. And if you think about it, we all know this to be true. There's no absolute no-brainer in urban design, but the closest we get is plant street trees. One of the things I'm proudest of is I've managed to get planting street trees now as an obligatory requirement in the National Planning Policy Framework. They're associated in multiple studies in multiple countries, obviously with cleaner air, but also with more walking, with better mental health, with knowing some of your neighbours more. So, basically, if in doubt, plant street trees. And that's why we need to push the decision of that sort of thing up, dare I say it, to the council leaders and to chief executives who can see the upside, whereas, of course, the poor, benighted highways officials often can only see the downside in terms of liabilities and costs. And those do exist. One shouldn't pretend otherwise, but that's why the decision I genuinely sometimes I'm looking at a council leader who happens to be on the train, I think genuinely is strategic rather than tactical, and that's a mistake that many councils make. This is from a very impressive study in Nature magazine. It was based on over 200,000 responses to 1.5 million images, mapping, because we've got now very, very locally precise data on mental health, and we can map images that are ranked as more scenic with local mental health. And what we find is an incredibly strong correlation. It's actually even stronger than greenery. Put differently, beautiful places make you happier. Again, there's correlation and causation going on there in a way we don't need to fully disentangle which is which. This is a similar study done about 30 years ago by a friend of mine, Jodan Rofe. This is an American study. This was before we had mobile phones, or at least much. And this is mapping where people said they were happy and liked to be and where they didn't. The blue, I think, was better and the red was less good. Slightly quieter streets, more street trees, more attractive buildings. Those were the predictors of happier places, and the opposite was the opposite. About 60 to 65%, I think 62.5%, of people's response, he calculated, was a response of where they were, and the rest was a reflection of who they were. So again, we're all humans. We can still make our own minds up, but we are influenced by where we go. This is a marvelous study done about 7 years ago. These buildings are in the same, well, not the same street, but they're in the same neighborhood. Students pretended to be lost tourists in front of both buildings. Nearly 5 times as many random passers-by spontaneously offered to help them in front of that building versus that building. Does anyone in the audience prefer that building? No, I thought you'd say that. It's completely predictable. It's completely predictable. And actually, I know the guy who did this, and he subsequently admitted to me, he's American, but he subsequently admitted to me over a beer in the West End that one of the spuriously lost tourists, i.e. a student, in front of this building, interestingly, had ended up marrying the random member of the public who had offered to help her. That is against all criteria of good social research, and some would say that it invalidates the research. I will leave it to you to make up your own minds. So places with coherent complexity, colour, texture, somewhere that invites you to walk, and with some symmetries and embedded symmetries, I'm going to spare you all the studies on this, are consistently more popular with nearly all of us, nearly all of the time. Not everyone, but between 70 and 90% of us in all the visual preference surveys, and we have some understanding as to why that is. So there you go. If you want to see more on that, more is available. Right, a couple of minutes on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and the new Office for Place. So a few years ago, 2018 in fact, the late Roger Scruton was asked to chair this commission, which was incredibly controversial with architects and planners. He was then taken ill, and I co-chaired it with him for most of the time. And we got it to a point, I think we were quite pleased with this, if I'll be frank, where not just were what we recommended accepted by the government, it was sort of tacitly accepted by the opposition, and many of the architects and planners who were thinking they were going to have a real crack at it actually ended up not having a crack at it, and this is a Sterling Prize winner who ended up actually agreeing with it, and as did other members of the great and the good in the design world. And what we pulled together was that, if you like, unspoken, bubbling beneath a lot of the headline debate about housing and the housing shortage, there was a desperate desire and need by many of the private. We got hundreds of people writing into us. Civic Voice and the RTPI ran polls for us. I'm not going to read them to you. You can all read. People actually really cared about the quality of new places, and there's polling on this as well. I've done that. Professionals actually ended up saying the same. This is a survey done by planning academics at UCL, showing that new places are just not very good. I'll come back to what that means in a second. One of the things we uncovered, now I know not all of you will be at unitary authorities, probably a small majority of you will only have highways, but this really matters because it actually affects highways as well. We've actually, for the last 70 years, not intentionally, we've been running a controlled experiment on planning systems, whereby we have local plans, on the whole, obviously at district level, which are much bigger, actually, than many areas would be done in much of the world, but critically, with far lower levels of clarity as to what is or isn't acceptable. I'm sorry that it's down at the bottom in the back. You're having to stand up. I apologize for that. It's not very, I should have the UK at the top. The local plan is a policy document in this country. In most of Europe, and not much, but by far from all of the states, it's a regulatory document. And that might seem like I'm dancing on the head of a pin, but it really, really matters. We have the most concentrated market. We have the highest levels of planning risk. A friend of mine, who actually, like me, married a French girl, but unlike me, went to live in France, he's actually quite senior in what we would call a housing association. His team can do a feasibility study on a site in about an hour and a half. Create Streets makes a good living doing feasibility studies, and I'm able to say happily we're able to charge for a lot more than an hour and a half's time. And we need that. It's a much more complex process in this country because there are far more trade-offs. We basically do planning by report, hundreds of pages of report for big development that often are never actually read. So we need to work out, and this is what we made the case. Actually, I should make a quick point historically as well. This didn't actually used to be the case. So if you recognize houses like this as the type of late Georgian, early 19th century house that we've all seen, that isn't because all architects and sort of landowners sort of spontaneously decided, oh, let's build them like this. Initially in London, and then with growing clarity beyond London, it was because the Housing and Building Acts of the late 18th, early 19th century, actually the 17th all the way through to the 19th century, just said so. So there were clear stipulations as to which type of house you should build. I'm not actually arguing we should go back to that, but I'm just saying the idea that we regulate what we build actually isn't new. So, oh crikey, that's not meant to have that extra complexity. I won't go through all that because otherwise I'm here for far too long. But we made a series of recommendations of how to bring forward the democracy into the setting of the local plan with clearer quality asks and a greater visual sense set locally of what people will like and how places will interact with the local environment and with existing places. That led to a series of, am I still okay for time, Richard? Just to check I'm not going for too long. Fine. That led to a series of changes, well, that led to a creation of the National Model Design Code, which I do recommend you have a quick look at. It's Googleable, which is starting to set a visual process for how parishes or districts or local planning authorities can say what good looks like round here and, done well, it won't always be done well, start to de-risk development, which is a key thing. It also led to key changes in the National Planning Policy Framework with a far clearer ask on beauty, sustainability and good placemaking, that they're designed with local communities and reflect local aspirations. I'd frankly like the wording to be a bit stronger there. And then critically, para 134, development that's not well designed should be refused. That was changing from development that is badly designed. And we're already seeing, hang on there, that's leading to actually to making it easier for local planning authorities to reject development as badly designed. This, I'm not allowed to officially be rude about developments when I'm wearing my office place hat, but this delight, this pleasure will sadly not see the light of day in consequence of the changing stats. It also led, among other things, to the change requirement or ease requirement for putting out dining onto streets, which I think was a good thing, which we pushed for, and actually now, which I mentioned earlier, to the requirement for new street trees on new streets, which again I think is unambiguously a good thing. And it's now getting easier, and I don't know if anyone from Surrey is present, this is actually what Create Streets is doing with Surrey. There are now a series of councils, highways authorities, county councils, starting to do much better street design codes, setting much more clearly street design to make it easier to walk, to cross the road, and encourage better placemaking. Onto the Office of Place. So as of July, the Office of Place is a new arm's length public body. We're based in Stoke-on-Trent. At the moment, there are 6 of us, and the board, which I chair, we're going up to about 25 to 30, so we'll remain quite modest. Above all, it's about changing, it comes back to that 2% and that 7% number. Our target, our challenge over the next generation is to take that 2% and that 7% and push them up a lot by fundamentally changing people's expectations, because reality changes, of what new places will look like, be like, and their impact on daily life. Using and making available to people like you, to parish councils, to district councils and to developers, the evidence, making it available, and hopefully over time, and it will not happen overnight, I'm here to do this for the rest of my life, moving from a vicious circle of parasitic development with unclear quality asks, opposition to development, high land prices, low take, and so on, to a virtuous circle of regenerative development where we have more confidence in the quality of new places. That's not going to happen overnight, and anyone who tells you otherwise, I'm certainly not saying that, you should mistrust. More sense of agency in design, and some reduced level of speculation as supply starts to go up. We're pushing and finding tools for enhanced co-design, a much greater use of visual preference surveys, and the good news is, and this has literally happened over the last 2 years, digital technology makes it essentially not quite free, but almost free now to do visual comparisons. It's totally transformed. These are the same house with just like different window patterns. This is the very first survey Create Streets did on this type about 8 years ago now. We do it better now with better image comparisons, much more properly controlled. But even this had an incredibly clear response. We asked this question, I think it was back in 2015 we did, yes, 2015. We said, do you support the building of new homes in a brownfield site near you? And we got from memory, I think it was, oh God, I can't remember, I think it was about 65% in principle said yes. And then we said, okay, fine, thank you. Right, do you support these? And we showed them these images, as they're not quite perfectly controlled. The 65 went up to 73 or 75% for Durenthorpe in Yorkshire and Poundbury in Dorset, but went down to 50, 34, and 23% when presented with something else. This is not being live streamed. No, it is being filmed. Oh dear, I better be careful what I say. Anyway, the architect who did this, who is actually I'd come to know subsequently, she's very nice, but she sits on lots of very important and influential panels and has won lots of awards. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. New places will not be the same as old places. They'll need to be greener. Partly because we've now got a requirement, a good thing I've argued for and got in there for biodiversity net gain in planning. So we'll have to be more thoughtful about how we use, or I should say rather preserve, existing hedgerows into new streets and squares, and the planting of street trees. This is actually from a master plan that Create Streets did in Devon a couple of years ago. And I should just make a point, because I haven't touched on this, and it's a big theme for me, but it's not really quite what I'm talking about today. This is also about sustainability, deeply about sustainability, because sustainability is not just the energy and use of buildings, jolly important though that is. It's also how we move around, and it's also actually the longevity, the resilience, and the flexibility of buildings. Some of you may have heard of a concept called embodied carbon. If you knock down a semi-detached Victorian house to replace it with the most energy-efficient passive house you can imagine, you've basically burnt about a century's worth of embodied carbon, either carbon used in building it. So even though that passive house will no doubt be much more efficient, you basically need about a century to catch up. It's often totally the wrong thing to do. If we can find new uses for existing buildings, their embodied carbon over their lifetime collapses. Actually you'll know this because this is in Wiltshire. This is in Tisbury in Wiltshire. This barn, I think, from memory, dates from the 13th century. It's just been turned into an art gallery for modern art. I don't think this will exist in 700 years' time. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. We need to create buildings that can find new uses, beautiful things for which we will find new uses because we wish them to. So the Office of Place, we're researching, supporting and accrediting, training, advocating and advising. We've supported 25 design codes, which I should have actually mentioned earlier, which is a way of putting more visual clarity into the planning system. And we've set, and I do go and have a look at our website. So these are now encouraged in the National Planning Policy Framework, and they will shortly be required by the new Housing and Regen and Levelling Up Act, which has obviously got parliamentary approval the other day. Design codes are a way of creating fast tracks for beautiful, popular local development by setting a clear visual ask of what's required, which doesn't just mean what the houses look like, it's the enclosure ratio, it's the sense of space, it's how you manage parking. We certainly Create Streets, this is not quite the Office of Place, we make it clear in the design codes have things that are musts, shoulds, and coulds. And the musts, it's just mandatory. If you're going to build, for example, in this bit of the Cotswolds, you are going to use Cotswold stone, end of that. If you don't want to, don't waste your time buying the land. Just factor it into the land price. That's again, about de-risking planning. What we'll be doing in years to come, so we're going to be doing a lot of research. In fact, we've kicked off our first big project with Ipsos Mori at the moment. We're going to be a lot of research into what people want, what they'll support, and as far as possible, making that available both regionally and locally. So if you're interested in getting involved, do get in touch with the Office of Place or get in touch with me, because we want to make that usable, essentially to all of you in this room and to hundreds like you. We're going to be supporting design codes and delivery mechanisms through funding, by sharing best practice examples, and we're starting to create a design code library, downloadable in time. It's actually already downloadable, but it'll get more and more downloadable and digitizable. Ultimately, the aim is of turning it into a totally digitizable process, so you can people will literally be able to go straight through and see what they can and can't get permission for. We're about to launch our next round of funding, which will be about linking through to delivery mechanisms such as local development orders and neighbourhood development orders. And we're going to start next year accrediting good design codes. We won't be rude about bad ones, we'll just be very nice about good ones. That's the decision we have strategically made. And we're starting to offer training and tools for people like you in how to de-risk planning. So again, do visit the website. But if you type Office of Place, you should be able to find it. Couple of quick thoughts. Richard's looking at me with, oh crikey, this would be so. 2 minutes, no, that'll be fun. So this is literally just pulled together very, very quickly and reflects a lot of the themes I've just gone through. I've tried to write on one page what I would do if I was in your shoes or a local planning authority, creating that virtuous circle with a clearer ask, more trust, more homes, and less land take critically, back to that gentle density theme, bringing democracy forward, as far as possible from the development control process back into the local plan or indeed to the highways plan. Beware of fake consultation, engage visually early enough and with real questions, not the fake questions that you see so often. This may sound abstract, but I really mean it. We've got to help our neighbours fall back in love with the future. De-risk development for good places. It's not the words, it's the pictures. Actually what places look like and how they feel really matters. Don't send mixed messages. We were just talking about this before I went up. I'm afraid there is an ongoing, as I'm sure you all know, challenge in terms of differing requirements from highways and local planning authorities. There's a scheme we're working on right now where I'm afraid that is our key problem. And then create gentle density places where we grow continuously and contiguously, that was hard to say in one sentence, from existing towns rather than putting all the money into heavy highways infrastructure and to drive to cul-de-sacs, which is massively greater land take and massively more expensive as opposed to active travel and public travel. I'll jump over that. It's getting much cheaper to engage wide using online tools, much, much cheaper, and come to the people, ask them what they like. We Create Streets always run visual surveys, and we get staggeringly higher responses when we go to Christmas markets or to summer fairs. Do you like this one? Do you like that one? And we poll for different types of things and pull up quite a confident brief that allows us to set a very clear brief, whether it's for the local plan or for a development brief. People, if you ask people some abstract question about planning strategy, 98% of them won't answer or won't be interested, and the 2% who are left are probably planners or local councillors. But if you show them pictures, they instinctively understand it, because this is something we all live. It's all part of our daily quotidian existence. This is from a master plan we're currently working on. We've got to help people see the future as something that can be better than the past. It should be beautiful, walkable, green, textured, with a strong sense of place, and create those pattern books. This is literally from Pattern Book, which we've just worked up in Worcestershire. And this is the key one, make sure it doesn't contradict highways, road belt, particularly in left behind towns. We've done analytics on this. All of the poorest and least prosperous neighbourhoods in England, every single one has a dual carriageway or an over-wide road taking up far too much tarmac, going right through its heart or going prominently along its side. Think about it. So we've got to move to developing places so we go back into gentle, lower land take, more prosperous, greater agglomeration effects, developments which, if you like, have the tightened highways, much less reliant on roundabouts and huge great dual carriageways, and allow our places to grow bluntly back in the pattern that they always used to. That would be my advice to you. That was far too long for me. That's it. I'm done. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
Thank you, Nick. If I have one ethos to the way I run a council, it's about prevention. And at the moment, planning is the antithesis of prevention. We've just seen how to make planning into a tool for prevention. I'm sure you've got questions, so over to you.
Hang on, I'm just trying to work my head with that. That was a criticism, wasn't it? Or was that?
No.
Okay, fine.
The current planning system.
Oh, I see the current planning system. Sorry, I thought you said, okay, fine.
Work. That's a way of creating places that people don't need help in.
Yeah, perfect.
They're
Thank you. Just checking all the negatives in that. I'm a bearer of little brain.
With Roger.
Thank you. Roger Goff, leader of Kent County Council. Just a very quick question. I think you may have answered it right at the end, but was the, when you said about the contradiction between highways and placemaking, was that simply what you were setting out in those last couple of slides, or did you have something broader in mind?
It certainly was that, and a very good question. Thank you, Roger. It's also, if you've got highways that says, I mean, we see this in all the work we do in the countryside. On the whole, people want extensions to villages to feel like they're part of this village, not part of a big suburb. So if you've got a highways requirement that has a huge, great splay junction taking up 3 times as much space, immediately, that will not feel like part of the highway, of the village. If you've got highways who refuse to sign off what local planning now require in terms of the street trees, then immediately you've got something that doesn't feel part of the place. Things like continuous Copenhagen crossings, wide pavements. It's literally there's a contradiction between those rules and where planning might be. And parking is another one that's a bigger discussion. It's that type of stuff. But I can send you loads on that if well.
I think it was Virginia next, yeah.
Yes, hello. I'm Virginia Taylor from Westmoreland and Furness, but we're in brand new unitary, so I've been planning in the former Eden. I'm interested in the status and the deliverability of these ideas. We won't discuss some of my ideological interest in them, but you mention accrediting design codes. And I just wonder what that actually means. So at the moment, the emerging design codes are SPDs. So this means that although they have some weight, in planning decisions. They haven't been examined. They're not fully part of the local plan as the others. So it's not guaranteed that these design codes will actually be put into practice, particularly when they bang up against viability, which for many areas is something which means that a great deal of what I've seen on screen is not deliverable because of viability. And the other thing is that just the time scales ensure that highways match. But I mean, there's a different time scale for infrastructure, for highways, which is how can you match up this ambition, this noble ambition, with the reality of planning and funding places?
Okay, so 3 questions there. Let me try and do my best to answer all of them. I probably won't give you everything you want. So just on the legal status, and as you're obviously aware, with the Regen and Levelling Up Act, there's another round of changes coming. So yes, they're better off in the local plan than in SPD, clearly because they've just coming in over the last couple of years. That hasn't sort of filtered through yet. There's live discussions now as to where design code should fit in the new planning system post the implementation of the the Regen and Levelling Up Act. As high up as possible is the answer to that, and that will take time. On the specific sub-question, because I know I had 3.5 questions, on accreditation, the point about accreditation is not to have an influence on their planning status, it's to celebrate and share with others the ones that we think will be the most effective in terms of de-risking planning and aligning to what people like locally. So it shouldn't technically have an impact on their planning status. Hopefully it will make best practice more widely shared and discourage less good practice. In terms of viability, the key thing here is land price, as I'm sure you know. Land price, land cost is far more significant above all in the south of England, less so up in the north, or less so in low value areas than build cost. That build cost has been very important in the last couple of years because of high inflation, but that actually is not normally the case. If you've got a clear quality ask, based on our calculations and indeed of others, it's very easy to do, I wouldn't say anything, but nearly anything in about 85 to 90% of the country, as long as it's understood at the point of land purchase. And that's the key difference. Now, this man in the front doesn't agree, but because the key point at the moment is that different developers vie up the price as high as they can within an unclear quality ask. However, where you've got a clear quality ask, we do in some places, on some things, that then gets factored in because they know they can't beat that. So do we still have viability challenges in some of the poorest bits of this country? Yes, we will have that, but that's the quota status right now. The trick is to de-risk it so people know that it is required in order to deliver. On the highways timing question, I'm not sure I quite understood what you were pushing at there, but clearly as plans and as highways plans change, is there a risk of them being out of sync? Yes, there is. Are they out of sync now? Yes, they are. That's the best I've got.
Thank you. We should have time for another couple of questions. I had a lady at the front there and then...
Thank you. One of the biggest needs for housing we've got at the moment is for accessible housing. And as county councils trying to deliver policies to enable people to stay at home, that's one of the most important to us. But we have housing policy being delivered by districts. Is accessibility part of your remit? Because I think it should be under the public sector equality duty. And if it's not, could you make it, please?
So accessibility at every level is absolutely core to what we do, because if you create, and this may not be the way you expect me to take this answer, but if you're creating homes in places where you're entirely reliant on cars and you're not round the corner from the neighbour's shop or from other people, you're creating fundamentally inaccessible, unsustainable places. So at the heart of what we're trying to do is to encourage the creation and the stewardship of homes, places, streets, neighbourhoods, where it is and remains possible for people to move around under their own steam for as long as possible. Nothing we do, and nothing anyone else does, contradicts building regs or requirement for lifetime homes at either level 1 or either level 2 or level 3.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question, so please be brief.
Thank you. I'll try and make it as brief as I can. Really interesting presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask you really about whether you have a part to play in the process of planning, in that I wanted to ask about I come from Somerset, the whole business of phosphates is going to unlock tens of thousands of applications coming through the system. Planning officers are rare, hard to find, and the system is going to get very, very busy. I wondered what your thoughts were on the statutory consultees that should be involved in the planning process, whether there's the ability to make sure that perhaps somebody like the ABI, the Association of British Insurers, should be involved so that properties are always insurable for the future, and I've got flooding in mind there. I wondered about finishing of estates before houses are sold.
Can we please draw the question? We're
will.
really running out of time.
And I also wondered about the ability for the public and others to question applications which rely on stuff that seems to be utter tosh in local views.
Nick, 15-second answer.
Right,
Thank
okay. So we're not a statutory consultee and are not trying to be. We're not going to get involved in individual processes, and we're not going to get involved with phosphates, important though that is, particularly in some places such as indeed Somerset. I'm nervous about having fundamental, you may not like what I'm about to say, I'm sorry. I'm nervous about having fundamental requirements or abilities to stop development based on unclear asks. So we've got a very bunged up system at the moment. Our game, and this is what Office Place will do, is trying to help councils, and indeed highways, set a clear equality ask, so it's completely clear that this is going to meet, if you like, dare I say, a tick box exercise. So I don't have a view on whether the ABI should be a statutory consultee. We, I'm afraid, won't be, and indeed you're deliberately not trying to be, because we want to help fix the system rather than get involved in case-by-case decisions, which obviously is dramatic and more work.
Marvellous. Thank you very much. Thank you for sending us away inspired to create better places.
Thank you. Discussing what should the manifestos offer county voters. I'm joined by Jessica in person, and then we have Andrew and Seb joining us virtually, I believe. I'll introduce them all in a minute. My name's Nick King. I'm the Managing Director of a company called Henham Strategy.
We're one of the strategic partners of the County Councils Network, and we're a policy and public affairs consultancy that specialise in local growth and economic strategy. My own background's in government, so I worked with Jeremy Hunt in opposition, and I was a special advisor from 2012 to 2018, mainly working as chief of staff to Sajid Javid. So I've seen a few manifestos in my time. As I say, I'll introduce the panelists in a minute, but before I do, I just wanted to briefly share some political analysis which we pulled together for Simon and James from CCN, which was really looking at the importance of CCN seats, or rather constituencies within CCN areas in the 2024 general election. The work we've mainly done with the CCN has been making the case for counties as sort of economic units and how important they are economically, which is undoubtedly true, but they're also really, really important politically. And when we look at the last 5 general elections from 2005 through to 2019, something like 235 seats have changed hands in that time between the 3 main political parties in England. So there's a lot of seats up for grabs. But of course, at the next general election, we've got new boundaries. So our starting point for this analysis was to look at what would have happened in 2019 if the new boundaries were in place there. Conservatives won 365 seats in the 2019 general election. With the new boundaries, they'd actually have won 376. When we then look at what might happen with those seats in the next general election, we see that 267 of the new constituencies are in CCN areas. So already you've got a big number, but of course quite a lot of those will be what you consider to be sort of safe seats. But actually, when we look at the battlegrounds, and we defined battlegrounds as any Conservative seat with a majority of 10,000 or fewer, or any Labour or Lib Dem seat with a majority of 5,000 or fewer. You can make your own judgment as to whether or not they are battlegrounds or not, but we wanted to demonstrate a bit of sort of political impartiality. 38% of the English battleground seats are in CCN areas. And then looking particularly at that Conservative number, any seat that's in Conservative hands at the moment with a majority of under 10,000, 48% of those seats are in CCN areas. So it's a really, really important bit of the electoral map and the electoral arithmetic for the next general election. Looking at that in a bit more detail, these are all the various different battleground seats laid out. The purple bars there are ones in CCN areas. And of the 154 marginal seats in England, by our definition, 59 of those are in areas represented by the 37 counties and unitary authorities that make up CCN. And they're in every part of the country. You see there, these are the top 10 CCN battlegrounds. They're in the Midlands, they're in the North, they're in the home counties, and in the West Country as well. So I hope that sort of sets the scene a little bit in terms of why county seats matter in terms of the next general election, and why all the main political parties should be thinking very clearly about what the offer is to county seats and rural seats. So with that framing in mind, I will come to our 3 leading lights of the think tank world. To those people who are sort of thinking, how important are think tanks in terms of the manifesto development for next year? The last Conservative manifesto was authored by the director of the Centre for Policy Studies. The Labour Party right now is relying very heavily on think tanks for a lot of its policy development. So they're really central to what's going on and what might appear in the manifestos next year. I'm not quite sure how the tech works, but I'm hoping that magically Andrew and Seb might appear on screen. It's a big reaction, Andrew and Seb. I don't know if you heard it, but you were greeted with roars of enthusiasm. Andrew, we'll start with you, if we may, and then I'll come to Seb. Andrew's the Director of Policy and Impact at Demos. Before that, he was Director of External Affairs at Social Enterprise UK. He's done a lot of work on various different areas of policy, including work on the Social Value Act, but also on civil society, tax policy, economic and business reform. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be with you. I think that this manifesto process is going to be really interesting, and because I actually think the 2019 election has sort of changed the game on manifestos. I'm sure you're probably all well maybe we're going back to the future, as it were. When we first had manifestos, they weren't really long, detailed policy documents. They were essentially just letters from party leaders to the country saying, this is what I want to do. I think the country's going in the wrong direction or the right direction. I'm going to solve it. And then I guess the classical period of manifestos has been in the period from kind of the sort of late 50s till basically till 2019, where manifestos were detailed policy documents, sometimes nearly 100 pages long. We're going to change this piece of legislation. We're going to change subsection 2 of this act and do this, or spend money on this, or here's a specific figure or program we're going to do. I think with 2019, what was interesting, and I say this not as criticism of the government or the Conservative Party in any way, but the 2019 manifesto was pretty light in terms of detail. I mean, it was big on ambition. It was big on analysis of kind of where the challenges were, but it didn't lay out exactly what the government's policy programme was going to be. And I think, frankly, I don't think any political party now, if it feels like it can win an election without giving a huge amount of detail on the manifesto, is going to go back to the old, if I compare this, to the 2017 Conservative Manifesto, which Nick Timothy famously kind of developed, I mean, that was a very, very detailed analysis and set of policy priorities and implementational solutions to what they consider to be the big challenges. I don't think we're going to go back to that. I don't think Labour is going to develop some big 100-page document like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell did that's fully costed with, 110 policy ideas. I think what they're going to do is lay out their missions. I think they're going to lay out some kind of philosophical points around that they want to reinvest in the public realm. They want to, work in partnership with business, blah, blah, blah. I think the Conservatives, I think you saw from Rishi Sunak yesterday, he's probably going to talk about his long-term values and plans. So I think from a kind of local government perspective, essentially, there's going to be a lot of question marks about the next government. And I think the manifestos will give us an interesting direction of travel, but I don't think we're going to see the level of kind of certainty that perhaps we might have seen in the past. And the idea that, if it's not in the manifesto, you can't implement as a government, you have the mandate to do the kind of ability to do that. I think what the 2019 election showed is you can basically make a vague statement that, we're going to level up the country and then just use that as the democratic mandate to do whatever it is that you want to do. So manifestos are going to be an important kind of battleground, I think, to lay out the kind of the competing priorities and missions and ideas that are going to motivate the next government. But I don't think they're going to be the kind of, comprehensive documents that we've seen in the past. So I think in kind of broad terms, what we need to be thinking about is, well, okay, then what are those kind of higher level strategic missions and challenges? And I think what's interesting is that, the Labour Party at the moment certainly is, it was only a year early at the start of this year that Keir Starmer was saying that we were going to kind of take back control. We're going to have a take back control bill. We're going to have significant devolution of power. Lisa Nandy was in post and she was a very strong kind of devolutionary kind of force within the Labour Party. She's gone. I don't think I've mentioned the take back control bill since. Alex Norris, who's an excellent shadow minister, and was really advanced this agenda. He's been moved out of his post. Paula Barker, who was the Minister for Devolution and Local Government, she's resigned and not been replaced. So, there's a lot of uncertainty about the relationship between the kind of priorities and the values and missions that this potential Labour government might have and local government. And on the Conservative side, I think, thanks to the great work from Onward and Seb and Adam Hawkesby and others, and Will Tanner, who's now in government over many years, Onward's made a really strong case around mayors and devolution and power and resources getting down to that level. But I don't get the sense that Rishi Sunak perhaps sees this in the same level of urgency as, say, Boris Johnson did. And I think it's still an open question as to whether there will be a real strong devolutionary offer from the Conservatives, although with Michael Gove still being in post, perhaps he will be able to grab hold of that section of the manifesto and write it in an ambitious way. So I think, overall my analysis would be for this that, yes, don't expect a huge amount of detail from the manifestos. They're not going to be your grandmother's manifestos you might have read in the past. They're going to be lighter, more strategic documents. And, in terms of where devolution and kind of local power and responsibility sits in this. I think it's still very much to play for, but I'm hoping my panelists will educate me and tell me where I'm wrong or where I'm missing the detail or where I'm missing the substance, but that's my view.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. As you say, Onward have done a lot of work pushing the case for devolution of powers down, and that work was started, I think, by Will Tanner, who's now found his way into number 10 as Deputy Chief of Staff, working on policy issues, and of course Adam Hawksby, who'll be known to a lot of you. Seb replaced Adam maybe a little under a year ago, I think I mind saying, and joined Onward from the Financial Times, one of a number of publications Seb wrote for before he joined Onward, where he's now the director. And he's appearing with a very sound publication as a backdrop on reforming stamp duty, but we'll leave that one for another day, Seb. Be very interested in your thoughts on devolution.
Thanks very much, all, and it's great to be there. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. It's Autumn Statement Week, and there's an awful lot going on in Westminster, as I'm sure you're all aware. Just reflecting on some things Andrew said there, that obviously the 2019 manifesto itself was, you're right, that it was not a large, detailed, heavy document, but I think the fact that it was a big, ambitious document that had a very clear vision for the country was a good thing. And the fact was that, Robert Colville and Rachel Wolf, who wrote that manifesto, put a lot of effort into making sure that the stuff in there was deliverable, that it was politically correct for the voting coalition the Conservatives were trying to appeal to at that point, and wouldn't come undone, because 2017 might have been a big tome of the manifesto, and I think Nick Timothy would be the first to acknowledge this, that maybe there was too much in it and there was too much detail that then created problems further down the line. So I'm personally not someone who necessarily believes there needs to be a lot of stuff in a manifesto. What it's there to do is to provide sort of the guide rails of where the government is going to go. And famously, if you look back at the 1979 Conservative manifesto and Margaret Thatcher's first election win, that was not a big document. It had very limited detailed policies. It was about the big overarching picture, and I imagine that's what we're actually going to see from both political parties in the 2024 election, because for the Labour Party, the way they hope to get into power is by not quite saying as little as possible, they've set a framing, they want to hold that framing and not have it challenged by anything else, and there'll be huge pressure from both the left and the right, the Labour Party, to put more stuff into that, to be more specific, and I think Keir Starmer will try and push back against a lot of that. And on the Conservative side, there's been a bit of oscillation, shall we say, in the government strategy. But I think with the reshuffle and with the Prime Minister's speech yesterday and with the autumn statement, we're kind of very much on a steady as she goes election. And I think, again, that will all lead towards having a manifesto document that is quite about big ambitions and guide rails, as opposed to lots of detailed specific areas they want to do stuff. But if you take the Rwanda situation, it could well be there is something notable in that in the manifesto to give a mandate that doesn't create problems in the House of Lords down the line were the party to win. But on your core question, Nick, about devolution and where it's going, the fact that Michael Gove is still at the Department for Levelling Up is what gives us so much cause for optimism at Onward, because we've done a lot of work with Michael Gove over the years, and he's someone who really does get the devolution agenda and has been trying to push forward with that, most recently with the Towns Fund, and that's based on a lot of work that we've done at Onward. And I think if you look at that announcement, we were cited significantly several times about where and what we wanted to see in terms of empowering towns, not just with further pots of money, but with actual powers. And I think that's where we're going to be focusing on in terms of what we would like to see in the manifesto, is to ensure that sort of levelling up 2.0, because we've got another round of the Levelling Up Fund coming early next year, and then obviously we'll be into the election cycle after that. We want to make sure that Levelling Up does become about actual devolution of powers, to give areas the powers to change taxes, to seek investments, to build in a way that suits them. So that's where our focus is. In terms of what the government is going to do, as has been the case, there's been one or two changes of prime ministers over the past couple of years. It's blown hot and cold on stuff. That during the brief Liz Truss period, there was the big focus on investment zones, which are still kicking around, and I think we're going to get some announcement of more of those in the autumn statement tomorrow. But ultimately, for us, I think it's about trying to maintain consistency of approach here, because one of the biggest problems the regional agenda has had, as you'll all know in the room, is that there's been so many approaches from the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, back to the Northern Powerhouse, into levelling up, into investment zone, back to levelling up again. And so ultimately, I think actually consistency is a really important part of this. So the aims that Onward is trying to focus on are what powers can be devolved, how can they be used, what kind of oversight do they have, and then of course trying to make sure as many parts of the country as possible have directly elected mayors. As and where that is receiving government, well, as you kindly mentioned it, Will Tanner, who is my predecessor and the founding director of Onward, he is in number 10 and is the Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff. And I think he will be very amenable to this agenda, because I mean, it's what Onward stands for in terms of believing in levelling up. But ultimately, I still think we're somewhere off the manifesto process beginning. The view within the government and Whitehall is we've still got, just over 6 months or maybe a bit longer to do serious governing time. So we've got the fiscal statement now, another one at some point in the spring. And if the election is in October, as I think we all probably presume it will be, then really, I don't think there'll be serious thought on the Conservative side of the manifesto until into the summer at that point. And then you'll have to see what the fiscal picture looks like, and particularly what the political picture looks like as well. Because I think, there are some on the centre right who will want the party to just focus on the core vote strategy, which is things like tax cuts and the classic Conservative ideas. But there are others, and that's very much where Onward sits as the think tank that believes the most in the post 2016 realignment, who want us to ensure that we are doing as much as possible to appeal to the voting coalition that emerged after Brexit, in terms of the Red Wall, which I've written about in my journalism books as well. So I think there will be a push-pull on trying to have more ambitious devolution ideas, and there will be others who will just say, well, actually, we haven't got time for this, and we'll be fighting hard to make sure that, particularly on the powers front, that's front and centre.
Fantastic. Thank you, Seb. Really interesting thoughts about the direction it might go in, and particularly on that fiscal devolution point, which I think we'll probably come back to on the Q&A. Our final panellist, and I'm particularly grateful to Jess for being here in person, otherwise I'll be a bit lonely standing up here by myself. Jess is Deputy Chief Exec of New Local, which is a think tank and membership network, and her work focuses on community power, public service reform and local government funding and finance. Jess was also formerly with the LGA, where you're a political advisor to the Labour group there, so knows our world well. Jess.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. I agree with what Seb and Andrew have both been saying about the kind of the structure of the manifestos. I think we are looking at, from both parties, quite kind of light, succinct documents. There seems to be a bit of a vogue for having 5 things to say. Rishi Sunak had his 5, I think he announced 5 new things on Monday, but there's still 5 things. And I don't know what they are yet, I haven't learnt them off by heart, but Starmer's got his 5 missions. So I think we can see from both sides there's a kind of focus on kind of a tight kind of indication of what might happen in the next 5 years rather than detailed specifics. But to an extent, I think it probably doesn't. The important thing is actually how you're going to deliver on promises, and I think that's been part of the challenge over the last recent years of policy. People have been made promises and the system hasn't quite been able to sort of deliver for it. And I think you're seeing things play out in the COVID inquiry at the moment, the degree to which the governance in this country is not kind of fit for purpose. And there's a centralisation used to be a kind of geeky fascination. I'm sure I would kind of count myself as one of those people, but I think we're sort of seeing a bit more of a sense of how the country doesn't work and how kind of top-down decision-making is failing us on a deeper level. And so it's sort of in that kind of light that I see devolution in the next phase of devolution. It's certainly been, it's been a policy for 10 years now, and it's been quite incremental. I appreciate that the policy is there, and it's been great to have something to kind of work with. I think the cusp of the next election, if there were to be a change of administration at central government, it won't be like doing away with the RDAs in 2010, for example. devolution is here to stay. The framework is here to stay. The elected representatives are here to stay. So it's a question about what you're going to do with it. So it is a kind of part of our landscape, which is good, but it's been slow. We've only recently got a proper transparent framework. It's been, I think, more focused on reform in local areas than it has been on reform at the centre. And I think the next stage is understanding how Devo isn't just a sort of opt-out or an ad hoc fragile policy, but it's actually shifts from being a kind of policy to more of a governance, a way of doing government, and clarity about what you do at the centre, what you might do over a kind of a wider scale, kind of regionally or county-wide, and what you might do locally, and crucially, where people and the voters feel that there's a different sense of government. And I think Keir Starmer's trying to get some of that when he's talking about a take back control bill, but it's right to be sceptical to say, it's very easy to kind of say all your hopes and dreams will be in this new take back control bill. Actually, we do need that kind of governance shift, and part of that is the centre letting go and understanding how you get kind of more impact in the challenging circumstances, the volatile circumstances of the 2020s. So I guess I'll say what I think should and where the opportunities are, not that I think I can see it's a kind of safety first election, and I don't think Labour will want to do too much to kind of rock the boat. The crucial thing to be kind of thinking about influencing is not the what, but the how. And I think that's really important for local government, because at the heart of a new devolution settlement, I think there needs to be a bit of a recasting of the role and relationship between central and local government, and a kind of maturing of what has been fractious, what has been kind of risk passed down through new powers, not a healthy way to do funding settlements, not a healthy way to see public money invested in a lot of respects, and to stop seeing devolution as a sort of a bilateral passing of specific powers from the centre to the local, but a different way of doing government. There obviously won't be any more money to spend. Both parties are going to be very fiscally cautious, but I think there's a real opportunity to look at how existing funding is spent differently for more impact. Devolution has become quite narrowly focused on economic growth, but also what particular government departments are prepared to kind of cede, and particular budget lines. Some departments have been able to kind of opt out of Devo entirely. Some departments, like health, are pursuing their own kind of place-based integration reforms completely out of kilter with devolution policy as we know it. So I think there's a real opportunity, particularly for Labour, because this is the policy was in their past. But I think there's a real opportunity to look again at total place style, kind of fund all the funding that goes into a place, how that's currently fragmented between different services, how much impact is that money having when considered separately through different government departments, and how can we think about it differently with local government obviously at the centre is the democratically elected layer, but equally local government understands partnership working. So how can we think about public service reform being part of Devo? And actually Greater Manchester was sort of where kind of devolution policy as we know it came from the Greater Manchester kind of model. Originally, they talked about public service reform alongside economic growth. It was about boosting prosperity and opportunity, but crucially, it was public service reform to remove people's barriers to economic participation through health, through skills, through all the barriers that exist to local people participating in new economic growth opportunities. So I think, I don't want to be all kind of retro, but I think there's a lot that we can look in the past and some earlier ambition on devolution. It's become quite narrow. It's not got the ambition it could. And I do think there's an opportunity to let people take back control, but they're not going to do it with a kind of isolated ring-fenced sort of spending initiative from DLUC. It's got to be a kind of a much more holistic vision.
Fantastic.
Oh, and fiscal devolution. Sorry, I didn't mention fiscal devolution, but that should be on the table as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jess. I think the conversation there was a lot about sort of what should happen, what we'd like to see. Then, of course, there's a question of actually influencing and how realistic it is to get some of these things appearing in the manifestos and then into policy. And I completely agree with your point about incrementalism. Actually, progress has been pretty slow, given that sort of successive governments, Conservative-led governments, have been talking a very good game on devolution. It's taken a long time to get where we are. And you mentioned the devolution framework. That was pledged in the 2017 manifesto that I contributed to. It was worked up within 6-8 weeks. It got published 4.5 years later and basically looked exactly the same as what had been produced in 2017. So you sort of wonder whose desk it was sitting on for quite some time. But it does feel like there's a momentum behind this initiative right now. If there's a change of government, which looks increasingly likely according to the polls, and Jess, I think this is a question for you. I just wonder how realistic it is to think that any incoming government that has diagnosed a set of problems, has some thoughts about what the solutions might be, for one of their first steps to be to give some of the powers and control away and put them in the hands of local leaders.
Well, I think this is the challenge. So the criticism of Labour will be it's really easy to promise devolution when you're in opposition, and it's obviously harder to lose control when you're in government. And we've got a very centralised political culture, so a lot of expectation is put on individual ministers, and a lot of sense that you kind of pull a lever and things happen. But that's kind of not proving to be the case increasingly. And I think we need to. I think we need a much. Rather than seeing it as kind of power from centre to local, it's actually more about a kind of governance system and at what level you spend public money for the greatest impact, and aligning that a little bit differently. So I think that one of the problems is less a political party problem, but also a Whitehall problem. And we've got a kind of structure of the Whitehall model, which has a lot of power. So a new government coming in would be advised in a particular way, and risk would be identified in a particular way. There's a real pathologising sometimes, I think, of local government, where you see kind of failure or risk as something that happens in local government. Enormous failure happens at central government. Enormous sums of money are wasted through schemes and outsourcing to the private sector, or things like universal credit, which took an enormous amount of time and cost to get right. So I think we need to see how do you kind of de-risk how you're spending money. And I actually think that closer to people, closer to communities, more community agency and voice and participation can make better outcomes. There's a hunger for it politically, and I think that there's just a different expectation about how you do government that needs to follow.
Yeah, I think there's always a certain irony to people in sort of central government saying we don't necessarily trust people on the ground to deliver certain things when you look at some of the failures of implementation and delivery at a central government level on the political and the civil service side. You say there's a political hunger, Jess, and I'll come to you on this, Andrew, if that's okay. I'd like to explore a little bit the extent to which we feel like there is a public thirst and a public appetite for more devolution at the local level, and you represent Demos, Andrew, the clue's in the name. To what extent sort of people out there are saying, right, actually, we're looking for devolution, and this will be a salient issue at the next general election? Because it feels to me like it isn't as salient as perhaps we might like it to be.
There's a lot to unpack in there, and it's a really interesting point. I mean, can I be blunt in these digital four walls? I guess, like, we've basically done devolution by stealth. Like, I remember back in the coalition government when it came in, we did try and do referendums across the country for elected mayors, for towns. And I think there was about 10 or 12 of those referendums. I think nearly all of them were lost, apart from Bristol, which has now actually scrapped the elected mayor for that city. And then after that, it sort of was a shift towards the kind of combined authority model. But that's kind of very much kind of, these deals are kind of cooked up at a kind of political level and then sort of implemented and, and taken forward from that. So I think what our research has found in the Demos area is actually the public didn't really understand the current devolution landscape. They didn't really understand who's responsible for what. They didn't really understand what's going on. I mean, we did a big piece of research. We did a useful piece of research end of last year, looking at Tees Valley, which obviously Ben Houchin has kind of been a real poster child from Conservatives for devolution. But when we focus group residents in the area, they didn't know what he was doing, really. They didn't really understand anything about what was going on there. So I think I met your point about saliency. Like, there's a risk here, which is that, we saw it with the regional assembly referendums that took place in the northeast of England. I mentioned those mayoral elections for towns and cities that the Conservatives tried to do and the Coalition tried to do in its early years. Look at events that are taking place in Bristol. I think, there's a lack of, we haven't really made this a kind of democratic process. We haven't really gone out to the public and said, this is our vision. And it comes back to some of what Jess and Seb and others have said, which is that, there's a fundamental problem, I guess, which is that from a political level, and, in a way we're a victim of our own success here, that, England is a very cohesive, culturally political unit, as in people in England really care about what happens in other parts of England. And it's not like United States where, I was watching in horror, at the, situation earlier on in Christmas where Texas, literally lost power because of kind of snowdrifts there. And you've got people from California laughing and going, stupid Texans, that's your fault. Why, you should have invested and you should have done that. And similarly, Texans or New Yorkers, they're having a go at each other from a kind of, from their own political perspectives. In England, I think, if there's a riot in Liverpool in the 80s, national government wants to respond to that because there's a public demand to respond to that. People in the south of England do care about that. And similarly, if there's a crisis in Birmingham when it comes to the moment with its kind of delivery of public services and going bankrupt, that is a national policy problem. So there's a slight challenge for us, I think, around talking about devolution, because from a political perspective, you don't want to look like we're sort of letting go, as it were, of going, if, so-and-so wants to do this and they mess up, that's their responsibility, centre is here only for X, Y, and Z purposes. People in England want to feel that sense of the government in Westminster is taking care of the whole country. I think that's where actually a lot of the levelling up rhetoric, yes, there was a lot of stuff around devolution, but I think people also saw that as just the centre caring about what's happening in the periphery and what's happening in different parts of the country. And so to kind of cut a long story short, I think that there is a bit of a democratic challenge here, which is, we know that we want to let people in and to participate in this process, and we want to try and get their buy-in to it. But there is a risk that if we do that, the kind of conclusions and the answers they come back with are not necessarily ones that policymakers want to hear. And I think on devolution, basically, I think the centre and the kind of and policy influence in the think tanks. You can't read a think tank report these days. It doesn't say devolve power, give more responsibility to X, Y, and Z, which I think has sometimes its own problems. But there's a general desire to distribute power, I think, throughout the country. But we need to find ways to bring the public into that conversation, I think, and make that genuinely transparent. And we actually have a paper coming out soon we've done in collaboration with Nesta, looking at some of what we call the fundamentals around this issue. And, people aren't really the mayors of Manchester and Birmingham, for example, and West Midlands, where Greater Manchester and West Midlands, where there has been a lot of these kind of trailblazer devolution deals, they're not seeing higher levels of voting behaviour and engagements from the public compared to those combined authorities where they have less power. So I think the idea that just distributing more power will make these institutions more salient, make devolution more on the public agenda, I don't think really kind of has a logic to it. I think if politicians and policymakers want to make the kind of structure of the UK, our devolved settlement, the role of local government, etc., at the heart of political debate, we need to be transparent about that and to be open about that and have that discussion rather than just assuming that there's a kind of incremental technical fix to that. I think, the evidence we get is that people are still pretty bemused and unengaged with the process of devolution.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I would like to come to the floor and see if there's any questions for some of our panellists. We've got one at the back, the lady at the back. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Amanda Hopgood. I'm leader of Durham County Council. I've listened with interest at that, and these manifestos need to have something that people can believe in. Now, we've heard about levelling up, and I have to say I cringe at the thought of levelling up too. We might as well call it potluck or lucky dip, because it's anything but levelling up. So we've got to get rid of these stupid captions that don't exist, that people have got no confidence in, because we've heard in this platform in the last 2 days how the most deprived areas of this country have been named and haven't had a sniff at levelling up money. So it's not levelling up, it doesn't exist. It needs to be something totally different. And we need to have people who understand local government working in Westminster, not Westminster talking about local government, how they think it works, because it's two completely different things. And I've heard lots of things today that don't resound at all with how local government works. And we've had things thrust on us in the last few years. You talk about spending.
Yeah.
We've had to spend millions to compete in a vanity competition that's never existed.
Okay, thanks.
And then you'll tell us we waste money.
That's a direct challenge to Seb Payne, who used Levelling Up 2.0, lauded the Towns Fund, and I know cares very deeply about the northeast of England. So, Seb.
Look, I think there's a lot in the criticism you say about how Levelling Up has operated, and I think Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, said after the last round of Levelling Up funding that we needed to end this begging bowl culture, because it is obviously not the most effective and best way to try and do stuff. And I just think that ultimately, I personally think that what we've seen through the almost hundreds of projects through the 2 rounds of Levelling Up funding are significant. I do think they will make a difference to real communities and to what people need in their environment. I do think the Towns Fund is important. And the creation of the directly elected mayors, we've seen obviously the North East Mayor, which is fantastic news, and we're seeing more, and the North Yorkshire Mayor, they've all come into creation. And I think they're all great developments on stuff. But where I think you are completely right is that ultimately, Levelling Up is not just about Whitehall doling out money. It's about trying to create the conditions that allow local conurbations to succeed and to thrive better than they have done as well. And I also think as well that, Levelling Up as the concept, you can look at it through many different historical versions of this. You've had obviously the regions policy under New Labour, you've had development corporations under Michael Heseltine, you can go further back to the Christian New Towns under Howard Wilson. The same nut we're trying to crack is the same basic problem we've tried to deal with since the end of the Second World War, which is how to better balance growth across the country and to help those places that need extra support. So ultimately, you might not like the name Levelling Up, but it is about the same problem, that we are overly centralised, that there's too much the southeast of the economy runs too hot, and there's so much untapped opportunity and potential in the rest of the country. And the fact that obviously Labour have bought into this, I think shows that it is something that is here to stay, that their take back control that Andrew was talking about, that is something where Labour is trying to embrace the ideas of empowering local areas. So I personally don't think that we should be forgetting Levelling Up. I think it's about what it looks like in the future and how to make sure we can eventually move away from what Andy Street called that begging bowl culture.
Thanks, Seb. Okay, so there we've had a question from the northeast. We'll do the southwest and then the southeast. So Cornwall and Kent, please.
Hello, I'm Kate from Cornwall. I'm interested about where you see net zero fitting as part of a new partnership between central and local government, knowing that the evidence is that actually net zero hotspots are in those levelling up areas, as the recent CBI report on mapping local net zero has shown.
Thank you. And thank you. Sorry, and we'll do second question as well. Sorry, excuse me. Can we get the mic? Sorry. Do another question here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger Goff, leader of Kent County Council. Just interested, particularly Jess made reference actually to Total Place, which I think I've been around long enough to have remembered that, and I think it was actually potentially quite a positive development. But my more general question, and perhaps particularly for Jess, but others may comment on it as well, is to what extent do we get a shift in the nature of how devolution might work from the model that we've seen in the Levelling Up White Paper to some of the rhetoric, certainly around the time of around the Take Back Control bill, which is about communities, unspecified, and indeed some of the work that the New Local itself has done, which seems to focus more on, if you like, more local communities. This is an audience of what are generally more strategic authorities. Is there a tension between those two approaches, and where does that actually leave this audience?
Fantastic, thank you. Jess, I'll ask you to respond to that one, and then Andrew or Seb, if one of you would like to come in on the net zero, that'd be great. I've chaired this terribly, so we've only got a couple of minutes left, so if you could keep remarks relatively brief, that'd be great, and I mean, I don't get in trouble with Tim.
Sure, and I don't think there's a tension at all. I think that one of the challenges with devolution, it's been sort of driven from the centre, and I would say that's a challenge with levelling up. It's still something that central government does to people, or does to, and it announces a new round of funding, but it keeps quite tight control. So it's very hard to do good strategic long-term decision making in an environment like that. And I think that partly what's behind a lot of this is that there's a clear need for policy stability, obviously funding stability, but policy stability so that long-term investment plans can be made, so that there's a genuine shift to prevention and partnership and collaboration that's needed for prevention. But also, it's not just in one when I talk about it not being in one direction, it's also about kind of feedback loops up the system. So the point that was made before about people who work in local government being in Westminster, we need to create a different system than policy is made on high in Whitehall and issued to local areas whose job is to deliver it. So just to your point, Roger, about that kind of point about scale, I mean, scale is really important. I think we don't have an understanding of scale within our policy-making system currently, and what is the right scale for what impact. So clearly at a strategic level, there are questions about transport or social care, strategic decisions about public service investment. And then there's a more local neighbourhood level where people will want to get involved in different ways, and communities feel things in very different ways. And it's at that kind of face-to-face, person-to-person opportunity that you get a different sense of participation in. So I don't think they're in tension, but I think we need to stop thinking about it being zero-sum and just thinking about how you get impact for decisions and investment.
Thank you, Jess. And Andrew, do you want to come in on the net zero question?
I actually want to come in just very briefly on that one, actually. I'm sure Seb will pick up the net zero one, but I just think that's a really important question and a really great point from Jess. And I think there's been far too much focus on political devolution and not enough focus on kind of community devolution, because actually I think what the evidence shows, you want to build social connection, social capital, social infrastructure, the stuff that's the kind of fundamentals that drive public service demand, the economic performance, people getting jobs, etc. That's best done at that kind of hyper-local community level. And there isn't a tension, but we do need focus on that. And we also need to figure out how these strategies come together, because just evolving power to, say, combined authority level, or just, giving, some tax tweaks to local authorities or whatever, isn't really going to fundamentally create that structure. So I thought it was a great question, really strong point.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, the community engagement point is really, really important. Seb, last word to you. If you could cover the net zero question in particular, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think obviously we've got some what we're doing at Onward about net zero and how it ties into local authorities to make sure they've got the powers and the know-how to deliver it. But I think in terms of how that looks forward into the future, I mean, there's been a lot of commentary on the government pulling back the net zero target from 2030 to 2035. I think there are huge opportunities there, and I think the government does see that, and I think they would always point to Tees Valley as an example of where there are opportunities from net zero to help with driving regional growth, to help with empowering those places. And I would very much hope that is a part of the next manifesto. We did a report called Red Wall Green Jobs last year that explained that this one of the greatest opportunities was provide targeted reindustrialization of many places that have lost jobs and lost prosperity. So ultimately, there's a lot of opportunities in net zero, and I think we did some polling quite recently urging the government to not water down any further, and so I hope they listen to it, because I think all the evidence is very clear that where they need to be is where the electorate is, and that is to push ahead with net zero and embrace those opportunities.
Thank you, Seb. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panellists for joining us today. I'm sorry we've gone slightly over, but it's been a great conversation. Lots of interesting material. I think the challenge for all of us is just making sure that all the different topics we've covered today, understanding how important county areas are economically, but also politically, getting that on the radar and the agenda of the people who be writing the manifestos next year remains a job to be done, but I know that the CCN will continue to rise to that challenge. So if we could all thank the panellists for joining us today, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and to the rest of the speakers. I have to say, personally, I hope that in all of the manifestos, there will be a real focus on localism and indeed a kind of proper framework, to drive a more preventative and early intervention approach, not just within local government, but across all of the public sector. But we shall see. Can I just remind you, please, before you leave after lunch, to make sure you've done the Zeller app and to just capture the carbon footprint. I've just got 3 thank yous. I did actually try to think of a couple of other people I could thank to get up to 5, but I haven't quite managed it. So the first thank you is and must be to our strategic and conference partners who have been fantastic, and without their support, we couldn't put on this conference. I hope you found it to be really informative. I think it's been a very successful conference. Lots of good conversations, lots for us to go away and think about. Secondly, can I thank the CCN team, and in particular, a special thanks to Hannah. This is a big job. There's a lot of work, a lot of effort goes into this during the year. So can I ask you to just give a big round of applause to all the CCN. And then thirdly, can I thank all of you for attending, for your engagement, for your support, your contribution. You are the CCN. And indeed, that I think we've had some really good conversations. I do think that, as I said at the outset, I think the CCN, it really punches above its weight. I think, we heard Michael Gove yesterday, I think absolutely on message in terms of what we've been saying to him we need to do or needs to be done. I think, tomorrow as you listen to the autumn statement, if we do get more money, that will be entirely down to the lobbying of the CCN, and we will take public credit for that. If we don't get it, then I can only assume our letter to the Chancellor must have got lost in the post or something. But anyway, it's great to see you all, and indeed, I hope that we will see you all next year for yet another successful conference. So have a safe journey home.